A little beggar interrupts the funeral of a millionaire's brother and shouts, "Dad is alive!" What she says next leaves everyone in tears. A soft autumn breeze swept through the church's stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the somber faces of the mourners. The interior of St. Michael's Chapel was filled with the quiet murmurs of those who had come to pay their respects to Thomas Bennett, a man known throughout the community for his gentle spirit and generous heart. His widow, Sarah, stood near the front, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly, while her 5-year-old daughter, Emma, clutched tightly to her black dress. Richard Bennett, Thomas's older brother, and one of the city's most prominent businessmen, maintained his characteristic stoic expression as he greeted the steady stream of well-wishers. Despite their shared blood, the brothers could not have been more different. Thomas, the eternal optimist who gave away more than he kept, and Richard, the shrewd businessman who had built an empire through calculated decisions and unwavering determination. The morning light filtered through the windows, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the chapel. Sarah couldn't help but notice how the sunbeams seemed to dance around the flower arrangements, creating halos of light that reminded her of Thomas's warm smile. Her thoughts were interrupted by Emma tugging at her dress. "Mummy, when is Daddy coming home?" Emma whispered, her innocent question piercing Sarah's heart like a knife. Before she could respond, a commotion at the church entrance drew everyone's attention. A small figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning light. As the child stepped into the church, the assembled mourners gasped collectively. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, her clothes worn and dirty, her feet bare against the cold stone floor. Her dark hair was tangled and unkempt, but her eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the solemn atmosphere. She walked purposefully down the center aisle, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her progress. Sarah felt Emma's grip on her dress tighten as the mysterious child approached. Richard straightened his posture, his expression hardening as he prepared to deal with what he assumed would be an unwanted disruption. The girl stopped directly in front of the casket, her small frame barely tall enough to see over its edge. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, with a voice that carried clearly through the hushed chapel, she spoke words that would shatter the foundations of everything Sarah thought she knew about her husband. "Daddy is alive!" The declaration hung in the air like suspended crystal, fragile and sharp. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet, her hand instinctively tightening around Emma's shoulder. Richard's face darkened as he stepped forward, ready to have the child removed, but before he could reach her, she pulled something from her pocket that made him freeze in his tracks. In her small, dirty hand, she held Thomas's cherished medallion, the one he had worn every day since his father had given it to him on his 18th birthday. Sarah had noticed its absence when they were preparing Thomas for the funeral, but the funeral home had assured her it must have been lost during the accident. "He promised he would come for me," the girl continued, her voice breaking slightly. "He said he would never leave me alone. He showed me this medallion and said as long as I had it, I would always have a piece of him with me." Richard moved closer, his business instincts taking over as he assessed the situation. "Young lady, where did you get that medallion?" His voice was stern but controlled, years of boardroom negotiations evident in his tone. The girl turned to face him, her chin lifted defiantly. "He gave it to me last week. He said it was time for me to have it because—" She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "Because Mama was gone and he needed me to be brave." Sarah felt her knees weaken, and she gratefully accepted the support of a nearby chair. Emma looked between her mother and the strange girl, confusion evident on her young face. The murmurs in the church grew louder as people began to speculate about what this could mean. Richard's mind was already racing through the possibilities: scandal, blackmail, damage to the family name. He had spent decades building their reputation, and he wouldn't let it be destroyed by what he assumed must be some sort of scheme. Yet something in the girl's eyes made him hesitate. There was a familiar stubbornness there, a determination he recognized from years of arguing with his younger brother about the importance of practical business decisions over emotional choices. The girl stepped closer to Sarah, holding out the medallion. "He told me about you," she said softly. "He said you had the kindest heart of anyone he'd ever met. He said you would understand." Sarah stared at the medallion, remembering how Thomas would absently touch it when he was deep in thought, how he would twist it between his fingers when he was worried about something. She had always assumed it was simply a nervous habit, but now she wondered what thoughts had really been running through his mind during those moments. As the gravity of the situation began to sink in, Richard made a quick decision. This was not a matter to be handled in public, regardless of its validity. He gestured to his assistant, who quickly began ushering the other mourners toward the exits, citing the need for the family to have some private time. The girl remained standing there, her small hand still extended with the medallion, as the church slowly emptied. The only sounds were the distant echoes of departing footsteps and Emma's quiet sniffles as she clung to her mother's side. Sarah finally reached out and took the medallion, its familiar weight now carrying the burden of unknown secrets. As she held it, she noticed something she had never seen before, a small latch on the side. With trembling fingers, she pressed it, and the medallion opened to reveal a tiny photograph hidden inside. The image showed a woman holding a baby, her smile bright and hopeful. On the back, in Thomas's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Maria and Isabella, never forget the promises we make." The private room adjacent to the chapel felt suffocating as Sarah sat across from the young girl who had introduced herself as Isabella. Richard paced near the window, his tall frame casting long shadows across the floor as the afternoon sun began its descent. Emma had fallen asleep on a nearby chair, emotionally exhausted from the day's events. "Tell me everything," Sarah said softly, her hands still clutching the opened medallion. "Please." Isabella's shoulders straightened, a gesture so reminiscent of Thomas that it made Sarah's heart ache. "Mama got sick last year," she began, her young voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much too soon. "We didn't have money for doctors, but then your husband, my daddy, he found us. He helped pay for everything Mama needed." Richard stopped his pacing, his business mind already calculating the financial implications. He remembered the unexplained withdrawals from Thomas's accounts over the past year, which he had attributed to his brother's usual charitable nature. "How did he find you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice gentle despite his skepticism. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "He said he knew Mama from before, from when they were young. He said he made a mistake once and he needed to make it right." She pulled a worn envelope from her pocket. "Mama wrote this before she had to go away. She said to give it to him if anything happened to her." Sarah accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, she found a letter, written in elegant, if shaky, handwriting. As she read, the color drained from her face. "Richard," she whispered, "you need to see this." The businessman took the letter, his eyes scanning the neat rows of text. The letter spoke of a time 15 years ago when Thomas and Maria had been young and in love. It spoke of promises made and broken, of circumstances that forced them apart, and of regrets that had haunted them both. But most importantly, it spoke of a truth that had been hidden for 8 years. Isabella was Thomas's daughter. "He didn't know about me until last year," Isabella explained, her small fingers twisting in her worn dress. "When he found out Mama was sick, he came to help. He said he wanted to tell you," she looked at Sarah, "but he was scared. He didn't want to hurt anyone." Richard sank into a chair, memories flooding back. He remembered that summer 15 years ago, when Thomas had been involved with a young woman from the wrong side of town. Richard himself had intervened, convinced that the relationship would damage their family's reputation. He had used his influence to secure Maria a job in another city, believing he was doing what was best for everyone. "Your mother," Richard said slowly, "she worked at the Hamilton factory, didn't she?" When Isabella nodded, he closed his eyes, the weight of his past decisions crushing down on him. Sarah stood up suddenly, her pregnancy making the movement awkward. "He was going to tell me," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "That's why he was so distracted lately, why he kept saying we needed to talk about something important." She touched her belly, thinking of the new life growing within her, a sibling to not one, but 2 children. Emma stirred in her sleep, mumbling, "Daddy," softly. The sound seemed to break something in Isabella, and she began to cry quietly. Without thinking, Sarah moved to comfort her, pulling the child into her arms. Despite her own turmoil, her heart ached for this little girl who had lost so much. "What happened to your mother?" Richard asked, though he dreaded the answer. "She got very sick 2 weeks ago," Isabella whispered. "The doctors said they couldn't help anymore. Daddy promised he would come get me after she couldn't finish the sentence. But then he didn't come, and the neighbors said he had an accident. But I know he's alive. He promised he wouldn't leave me alone." Sarah and Richard exchanged glances, the weight of the situation settling over them. Thomas had indeed been planning to bring Isabella home, to merge his two worlds, when fate had cruelly intervened. The accident had left not just a widow and daughter behind, but another child who had already lost too much. Richard moved to the window, looking out at the gathering dusk. He could see the reporters already starting to gather outside the church, word of the dramatic scene having spread quickly. His phone had been buzzing continuously with messages from board members and business associates, all concerned about the potential scandal. But as he turned back to look at Sarah holding Isabella, with Emma sleeping nearby, he saw something that made his carefully constructed world of profit margins and business decisions shift on its axis. He saw family, broken, complicated and messy, but family nonetheless. Sarah seemed to read his thoughts. "She stays with us," she said firmly, her arms still around Isabella. "It's what Thomas would have wanted, and it's what's right." "The press will have a field day," Richard warned, though his tone lacked its usual conviction. "The board members are already calling for damage control." "Then control the damage," Sarah replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "But Isabella is Thomas's daughter, which makes her family, and we don't abandon family." Isabella looked up at Sarah, hope warring with fear in her young eyes. "You want me to stay with you?" "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah answered, smoothing the girl's tangled hair. "You're not alone anymore. We'll figure this out together." As if in response to her words, Emma began to wake up, her small face scrunching in confusion as she took in the scene before her. She looked at Isabella, then at her mother, questions forming on her lips. Richard watched as his carefully ordered world continued to shift and change. He thought of Thomas, of all the times he had lectured his younger brother about being too soft, too generous, too focused on helping others instead of helping himself. Now standing in this room with the consequences of past decisions and hidden truths laid bare, he wondered if perhaps Thomas had understood something about life that he, with all his wealth and power, had missed entirely. The Bennett mansion stood like a sentinel against the darkening sky, its imposing architecture a testament to generations of wealth and influence. As Richard's car pulled through the ornate gates, Isabella pressed her face against the window, her eyes wide with wonder. Emma, sitting beside her, watched the newcomer's reaction with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Sarah sat in the front passenger seat, her mind racing with practical concerns. Where would Isabella sleep? What about school? How would she explain this situation to Emma? The weight of Thomas's secrets pressed heavily on her heart, but she couldn't deny the instant connection she felt to this child, who had his same determined spirit. "Your house is like a castle," Isabella whispered, her voice carrying a touch of awe that momentarily masked the grief in her eyes. Richard glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of the girl's expression. It reminded him of another time, years ago, when Thomas had brought home a stray puppy, his eyes shining with the same mixture of hope and uncertainty. Richard had insisted the dog be taken to a shelter, citing practical reasons: their father's allergies, the expensive carpets, the family image. Now looking at Isabella, he wondered how many of his practical decisions had caused more harm than good. As they entered the house, Mrs. Hudson, the housekeeper who had served the Bennett family for over 2 decades, greeted them with her usual efficiency. However, upon seeing Isabella, her practiced composure faltered slightly. "Mr. Bennett, shall I prepare the blue guest room?" "No," Sarah interjected before Richard could respond. "She'll stay in the room next to Emma's." She turned to Isabella, whose small frame seemed even tinier in the grand entrance hall. "Would you like that? To be close to your sister?" The word sister hung in the air, causing both girls to look at each other with new awareness. Emma's lower lip trembled slightly, but she didn't protest. Isabella nodded slowly, clutching the worn backpack that contained her few possessions. "Mrs. Hudson," Richard added, his voice carrying an unusual note of gentleness, "please have some proper clothes sent up for Isabella. And perhaps a warm bath could be arranged?" As Mrs. Hudson led the girls upstairs, Sarah sank into one of the antique chairs in the foyer, her hand resting on her belly. "Richard, what are we going to do? The funeral is barely over, and already everything we thought we knew about Thomas has been turned upside down." Richard loosened his tie, a rare gesture of vulnerability. "I need to make some calls. The press will be all over this by morning, and we need to control the narrative." He paused, then added more softly, "But first, I need to show you something." He led Sarah to his home office, a room that perfectly reflected his personality, everything in its place, every detail carefully chosen to project power and success. From his desk drawer, he withdrew a thick manila envelope, its edges worn with age. 15 years ago, he began, his voice heavy with confession, "when Thomas was seeing Maria, I thought I was protecting our family by separating them." He handed Sarah the envelope. "These are letters that Maria wrote to Thomas after she left, letters that I intercepted." Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of letters, their pages yellowed with time. As she read, her eyes filled with tears. The letters told a story of love, of heartbreak, and of a young woman who had discovered she was pregnant after being forced to leave town. "She tried to tell him," Sarah whispered, looking up at Richard with accusation in her eyes. "All these years she tried to tell him about Isabella." Richard sank into his leather chair, looking older than Sarah had ever seen him. "I convinced myself I was doing the right thing. The Bennets had a reputation to maintain. Thomas was too young, too idealistic. Maria was from the wrong social circle. It all seemed so clear back then." Upstairs, they could hear the faint sounds of children's voices and running water. Life continuing, changing, evolving, despite the weight of past decisions and present grief. "I never gave him the letters," Richard continued, his voice thick with regret. "I told myself he would thank me someday, that he would understand it was for the best. When he met you," he looked at Sarah, "I thought I had been proven right. You were perfect for him, from the right family with the right connections." Sarah stood up abruptly, anger flashing in her eyes. "Perfect? Right? Do you think any of that matters now? Thomas had a daughter he never knew about because of your interference, a child who grew up without her father, because you decided to play God with their lives." Her words echoed in the wood-paneled office, sharp with truth. Richard didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he pulled out another document from his desk, a legal paper with Thomas's signature. "6 months ago, Thomas came to me for legal advice about adoption procedures," he said quietly. "He didn't tell me who he wanted to adopt, but now I understand. He was planning to make everything right." Before Sarah could respond, a small voice from the doorway interrupted them. "Mommy?" Emma stood there in her pajamas, looking uncertain. "Isabella is crying in her room. She says she wants her daddy." Sarah exchanged a look with Richard before hurrying to follow Emma. As they approached Isabella's room, they could hear muffled sobs through the door. The sound pierced through all the complications of adult decisions and family reputations, reminding them that at the heart of this situation was a child in pain. Inside the room, they found Isabella, curled up on the large bed, her wet hair soaking the pillow, her small body shaking with grief. She had changed into new pajamas that Mrs. Hudson had provided, making her look even younger and more vulnerable. Without hesitation, Sarah sat on the bed and gathered Isabella into her arms. Emma hovered nearby, then slowly climbed onto the bed as well. Richard watched from the doorway as Sarah began to hum a lullaby, the same one she used to comfort Emma after nightmares. "I miss him," Isabella whispered between sobs. "I miss Mama too. Why did they have to go away?" Sarah held her tighter, her own tears falling freely now. "I miss him too, sweetheart, we all do. But you know what? He gave us a wonderful gift before he left. He gave us you. And we're going to take care of each other now, just like he would have wanted." Emma, moved by the scene, hesitantly reached out and took Isabella's hand. The gesture, simple but profound, seemed to bridge some invisible gap between them. Richard, watching his nieces find comfort in each other's presence, felt something shift in his carefully ordered worldview. The past couldn't be changed, but perhaps the future could still be shaped by love rather than practicality, by healing rather than control. As he watched the three of them on the bed, Sarah, Emma, and Isabella, he made a silent promise to his brother. This time he would make the right choice. The next morning brought chaos to the Bennett household. News vans lined the street outside the mansion's gates, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking the sun. Inside, phones rang incessantly as reporters, business associates, and family friends all sought answers to the previous day's dramatic revelations. Sarah sat at the kitchen island, attempting to eat the breakfast Mrs. Hudson had prepared, while simultaneously scrolling through dozens of messages on her phone. The morning news was playing silently on a wall-mounted screen, showing footage of yesterday's scene at the church. Even without sound, the headlines told the story. Bennett family scandal, secret child appears at funeral. "They're calling her a secret love child," Richard said with disgust as he entered the kitchen, already impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. "I've got the PR team working on damage control, but we need to be careful about how we handle this." "Handle this?" Sarah looked up from her phone, her voice sharp. "She's not a business crisis, Richard. She's a little girl who just lost both her parents." Before Richard could respond, the sound of children's laughter drifted in from the garden. Through the French doors they could see Emma showing Isabella her favorite climbing tree. Isabella, dressed in new clothes that Mrs. Hudson had rushed to purchase, looked almost like a different child from the one who had appeared in the church yesterday. "They seem to be getting along better this morning," Sarah observed, her expression softening as she watched the girls. Richard nodded, though his mind was clearly on other matters. "The board is calling an emergency meeting this afternoon. They're concerned about the impact on company shares." He hesitated, then added, "There's also the matter of Thomas's will." Sarah's hand instinctively went to her belly. "What about it?" "It needs to be amended to include Isabella. As his biological daughter, she has rights, but the situation is complicated." Richard pulled out his phone, showing Sarah an email from the family's legal team. "There will need to be DNA tests, documentation of Maria's passing, proof of paternity. More proof than Thomas's own words in that letter? Than the medallion he gave her?" Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Hudson, who entered carrying a stack of newspapers. "I thought you should see these," she said quietly, spreading them across the counter. The headlines varied from sensational to sympathetic, but all focused on the same story. Photos of Isabella at the church were splashed across the front pages, along with old pictures of Thomas and speculation about his relationship with Maria. "We need to protect her from this," Sarah said firmly, pushing the newspapers away. "She's been through enough already." As if on cue, Isabella and Emma came running into the kitchen, their faces flushed from playing outside. Isabella stopped short when she saw the newspapers, her eyes catching sight of her own photo. "Why am I in the newspaper?" she asked, her voice small. Richard quickly gathered up the papers, but the damage was done. Emma, curious, tried to peek at them. "Is it because Isabella is my sister now?" she asked innocently. The adults exchanged glances, unsure how to explain the complexity of the situation to the children. But before they could try, the doorbell rang, followed by Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps and the sound of arguing voices. "Richard!" a sharp voice called from the foyer. "Richard, we need to talk about this immediately." Richard's face hardened as he recognized the voice of his Aunt Margaret, the family matriarch, and one of the largest shareholders in the Bennett Corporation. Sarah instinctively moved closer to the girls, while Richard stepped toward the foyer to intercept his aunt. "Not now, Margaret," they heard him say firmly. "Not now? Have you seen the papers? The news? This scandal could ruin everything your father built." Margaret's voice carried clearly despite Richard's attempts to keep her in the foyer. "That child needs to be dealt with before—" "That child," Richard's voice cut through his aunt's tirade with unexpected force, "is my brother's daughter and a Bennett, and she will be treated as such." The silence that followed his declaration was broken only by Isabella's quiet sniffling. Sarah looked down to find tears rolling down the girl's cheeks. "I don't want to cause trouble," Isabella whispered. "Maybe I should go away." "No," Emma grabbed Isabella's hand fiercely. "You're my sister now. Daddy would want you to stay." Sarah knelt down between the girls, pulling them both into her arms. "Emma's right, sweetheart. This is your home now and we're your family. No one is going to change that." In the foyer, they could hear Richard firmly escorting his aunt out, his voice low but determined as he explained that times had changed, and so had the Bennett family's priorities. Mrs. Hudson busied herself preparing hot chocolate for the girls, her own way of providing comfort in the midst of chaos. As she worked, she began humming softly, the same lullaby Sarah had sung the night before. Watching the scene unfold, Sarah realized that while they couldn't shield the girls from every harsh reality, they could show them what family truly meant. Not the carefully curated image that the Bennett name had represented for generations, but the messy, complicated, loving truth of people who chose to stand by each other no matter what. Isabella sipped her hot chocolate, leaving a small chocolate mustache that made Emma giggle. For a moment, they were just two sisters sharing a morning treat, untouched by the storm of adult complications raging around them. When Richard returned to the kitchen, his tie slightly askew from the confrontation, he paused at the sight before him. Then, in a gesture that would have shocked his business associates, he loosened his tie completely and sat down at the counter. "Mrs. Hudson," he said, "I believe I'll have some of that hot chocolate as well." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the Bennett Corporation's boardroom windows as Richard faced the assembled board members. Their faces, usually masked with careful corporate neutrality, now showed varying degrees of concern and disapproval. At the head of the table, Aunt Margaret sat like a queen on her throne, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her expression stern. "The market response has been concerning," Charles Wilson, the chief financial officer, reported, while sliding charts across the polished table. "Our stock has dropped 15% since yesterday's news broke. Major investors are demanding answers." Richard stood at the window, his back to the board, watching the city sprawl beneath him. The empire he and his father had built seemed somehow smaller today, less important than the tearful face of a little girl asking if she needed to leave. "Let them demand," he said finally, turning to face the room. "The Bennett Corporation has weathered worse storms." "This isn't just about the stock price, Richard," Margaret interjected, her voice sharp as cut glass. "It's about the Bennett name. Your father built this company on reputation, on trust. Now we have this situation with Thomas's illegitimate child splashed across every newspaper in the country." Richard's jaw tightened at the word illegitimate. "Her name is Isabella," he said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "And she's my brother's daughter." "Which is precisely the problem." Margaret stood, her hands pressing against the table. "We need to handle this discreetly. I've already spoken with Stevens at the Mountain View Children's Home. They're willing to take her, provide for her education, keep everything quiet." "No." Richard's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Richard, be reasonable," Charles began. But Richard held up his hand. "For 30 years, he said, pacing the length of the boardroom, "I've sat in this room and made decisions based on what was best for this company. I've sacrificed relationships, ignored my conscience, all in the name of protecting the Bennett legacy." He stopped, looking each board member in the eye. "But I've learned something from my brother's death. Legacy isn't just about stock prices and corporate acquisitions." He pulled out his phone, bringing up a photo he'd taken that morning. Emma and Isabella sitting together at breakfast, sharing secrets and giggling over their cereal. He passed the phone around the table. "This is legacy too," he continued. "The choice to do what's right, not just what's profitable. Thomas understood that long before I did." Margaret sniffed dismissively. "Thomas's bleeding heart is what got us into this mess in the first place." "Nurse," Richard's voice was steel now, "my interference is what created this situation. 15 years ago, I made decisions that kept a father from his daughter. I won't compound that mistake now." He walked to his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I've had my legal team draw up new papers. Isabella will be formally recognized as Thomas's heir, with all the rights and protections that entails. Additionally, I'm establishing a charitable foundation in Thomas's name, focused on helping single parents and children in need." The board erupted in protests, but Richard continued, his voice rising above the chaos. "This isn't up for discussion. I'm not asking for permission. I'm informing you of my decision as CEO." "You can't do this." Margaret stood, her face flushed with anger. "The board won't stand for it." "Actually," Richard allowed himself a small smile, "I can. While you were all calling emergency meetings about our stock price, I spent the morning converting my preferred shares to voting shares. Combined with Thomas's shares, which now belong to his children, I have controlling interest in the company." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles was the first to recover, already calculating the implications. "The foundation, it could actually work in our favor. Position the company as socially responsible, family-oriented," but Richard was already gathering his things. "Schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. We'll announce everything then. Isabella's recognition as Thomas's daughter, the foundation, all of it. And Margaret." He turned to his aunt, whose face had gone pale with fury. "Remember that family means more than just business." As he left the boardroom, his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Isabella asked about her mother's things. Think it's time to visit Maria's apartment. Will you come?" Richard paused in the elevator, remembering the last time he'd seen Maria 15 years ago. He'd offered her money to leave town, to stay away from Thomas. She'd refused the money but left anyway, carrying a secret she would keep for 8 years. "On my way," he typed back, then added, "Everything will be okay." Across town, Sarah sat in the garden watching the girls play. Emma was teaching Isabella how to make daisy chains, their heads bent together in concentration. The sight made her heart ache with a mixture of joy and sadness. Joy at seeing them bond, sadness at thinking of all the years they'd lost. Mrs. Hudson approached with a tray of lemonade and cookies. "The girls seem to be settling in," she observed, her usual efficiency softened by genuine affection. "They are," Sarah agreed, then noticed Isabella had stopped playing, her small face turned toward the house. Following her gaze, Sarah saw what had caught her attention: Thomas's study, untouched since the accident, visible through the French doors. Isabella stood slowly, the half-finished daisy chain falling from her fingers. Can I go in there?" she asked hesitantly. Sarah reached out her hand. "Of course, sweetheart. Would you like me to come with you?" Both girls took her hands as they walked to the study. The room still smelled like Thomas, his favorite leather chair, the books he loved, the lingering scent of his cologne. Emma immediately went to his desk, where she had often sat while he worked. But Isabella stood in the doorway, her eyes wide as she took in this new piece of her father's life. "He used to sit here and read to me," Emma said softly, running her hand along the desk's smooth surface. Isabella moved slowly into the room, touching things gently, the spines of books, the edge of a picture frame, the soft leather of his chair. Then she saw it, a small wooden box on his desk, carved with intricate patterns. "That's where Daddy kept his special things," Emma explained. Sarah picked up the box, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside were photos, letters, and at the bottom a worn envelope addressed to "My dearest Maria." The letter was dated just 3 weeks ago. The apartment building stood in stark contrast to the Bennett mansion, its weathered brick facade and rusted fire escapes, telling stories of lives lived modestly but with dignity. Sarah held Isabella's hand as they climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, Richard following behind with Emma. The key to Maria's apartment felt heavy in Sarah's pocket, given to them by the sympathetic building manager who remembered the quiet woman and her determined daughter. Isabella stopped at a door marked 3B, her free hand reaching out to touch the peeling paint. "Mama always said she was going to repaint it pink," she said softly, "when she got better." Sarah squeezed her hand gently as Richard stepped forward to unlock the door. The apartment beyond was small but neat, with carefully arranged second-hand furniture and walls decorated with Isabella's artwork. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, casting warm patches on a worn but spotless carpet. Emma looked around curiously, taking in this other world that had been part of her father's secret life. "It's cozy," she declared, earning a small smile from Isabella. But it was the collection of photographs on a shelf that drew their immediate attention. Among pictures of Isabella and Maria were several of Thomas, recent ones, showing him with Isabella at a park, helping her with homework, sharing ice cream cones on a sunny day. In each photo, his smile was genuine, his eyes bright with love for his daughter. Sarah picked up one of the frames, her fingers tracing Thomas's familiar features. "He looks so happy," she whispered, tears threatening to fall. Richard moved to a small desk in the corner where neat stacks of papers were arranged, medical bills, school records, and beneath them all, a leather-bound journal. He lifted it carefully, recognition dawning in his eyes. "This was Maria's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She used to carry one just like it in high school, always writing in it during lunch breaks." Isabella nodded. "Mama wrote in it every day. She said it was important to keep memories safe." Sarah settled on the worn sofa, drawing both girls close to her. "Would you like me to read some of it?" she asked Isabella gently. When the child nodded, Sarah opened the journal to a marked page. "My dearest Isabella," she read aloud, "there are so many things I need to tell you, so many truths that you deserve to know. Your father, Thomas, was the kindest man I ever knew. When we were young, we dreamed of a future together, but life had other plans." Richard sat heavily in a nearby chair as Sarah continued reading. The journal told a story different from what he had believed all these years. Maria hadn't left just because of his interference. She'd left to protect Thomas from a choice that would have torn him apart. "His father was dying," Sarah read, her voice catching, "and the company was in trouble. Richard was right about one thing. The Bennett name needed Thomas, but I couldn't let him give up his family's legacy for me. So I made the choice for him, carrying you, my precious secret, away with me." Emma leaned forward, absorbed in this story of her father's past. Isabella sat very still, her eyes fixed on her mother's handwriting. "What I didn't know then," Sarah continued reading, "was that Thomas would have chosen love over legacy. He proved that when he found us last year, when he discovered the truth about you, Isabella. He proved it every time he visited, every time he helped us, every time he promised to make things right." Richard stood abruptly, moving to the window. The weight of his past assumptions, his certainty that he had known what was best for everyone, pressed down on him like a physical burden. "There's more," Sarah said softly, turning the page. "The last entry, dated just days before." But before she could continue, Isabella spoke up. "Mama told me something important was going to happen. She said Daddy was going to fix everything, that we were all going to be together." Richard turned back from the window. "The adoption papers," he said. "Thomas wasn't just planning to adopt Isabella. He was going to tell everyone the truth, wasn't he?" Sarah nodded slowly, reading further in the journal. "He had it all planned out. He was going to tell me first, then help Maria move closer so Isabella could be part of both families. He believed in my capacity for understanding, for love." "He was right," Emma said suddenly, hugging Isabella. "Daddy always said Mommy had the biggest heart in the world." The simple truth in a child's words brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. She pulled both girls closer, feeling the baby kick as if in agreement. Richard moved to the desk again, examining the papers more carefully. Among them, he found something that made his breath catch, a series of letters, all returned unopened, all addressed to Thomas at the Bennett mansion, all marked with his own handwriting. "Return to sender." The reality of his past actions hit him with full force. He had been so convinced of his own righteousness, so certain that he was protecting his brother, that he had never considered the lives he was destroying in the process. "There's something else," Isabella said quietly, moving to a small closet. From inside, she pulled out a wrapped package. "Mama said to give this to Daddy when he came to get me. But now—" Sarah helped her unwrap it. Inside was a handmade photo album, carefully decorated with Isabella's artwork. Page after page showed moments from her life. First steps, first day of school, birthdays, ordinary days made extraordinary by a mother's love and a daughter's spirit. On the last page was a recent photo of Thomas, Isabella, and Maria together, all three smiling at the camera. Below it, in Maria's elegant handwriting, were the words, "Love doesn't divide, it multiplies. Thank you for coming back to us, Thomas." The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the apartment's worn floor. In that gentle dimness, surrounded by evidence of a love that had never died and truths that could no longer be hidden, the remnants of two families began to truly become one. The morning of the press conference dawned bright and clear, but the atmosphere inside the Bennett mansion was tense. Sarah stood in front of her closet, trying to find something appropriate to wear, her hand absently rubbing her growing belly. The baby had been particularly active since yesterday's visit to Maria's apartment, as if sensing the emotional turbulence around them. "Mrs. Bennett?" Mrs. Hudson's voice called softly from the doorway. "The girls are asking for you. Isabella, she's having a difficult morning." Sarah found the girls in Isabella's room, where Emma was trying unsuccessfully to comfort her new sister. Isabella sat on the bed, still in her pajamas, clutching the photo album they'd brought from her old apartment. "I don't want to go," Isabella whispered as Sarah entered. "Everyone will be looking at me, the people with camera. They're scary." Sarah sat beside her, pulling both girls close. "You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with, sweetheart. Uncle Richard can handle the press conference without us." "But," Isabella's voice trembled, "but what if they say bad things about Mama or Daddy? I heard Mrs. Kingston on the phone yesterday saying Mama trapped Daddy." Sarah's heart clenched at the revelation that Isabella had overheard the gossiping housekeeper, whom Richard had promptly dismissed. "Listen to me, both of you," she said firmly, including Emma in her gaze. "Love is never a trap. Your father loved both of you, and he loved your mothers. Anyone who says differently doesn't understand what really matters." Emma nodded solemnly. "Daddy always said love makes families, not rules." A knock at the door revealed Richard, already dressed in his finest suit, but looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "May I come in?" As he entered, Sarah noticed he was carrying something, a small gift box wrapped in silver paper. "Isabella," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed, "I have something for you. Something that should have been yours a long time ago." Isabella accepted the box cautiously. Inside, nestled in soft velvet, was a delicate silver locket. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Mama had one just like this." "Yes," Richard's voice was rough with emotion. "Thomas and I gave matching lockets to our sweethearts at the spring formal, our senior year of high school. Your mother, she was wearing hers the last time I saw her." He helped Isabella open the locket, revealing tiny photographs inside, one of Thomas and Maria in their youth, laughing at some forgotten joke, and one of Thomas with Isabella from just a few months ago. "I found this in Thomas's study last night," Richard continued. "He'd had it made for you. The note with it said he was planning to give it to you when everything was out in the open." Isabella touched the locket gently, tears sliding down her cheeks. But these tears seemed different from her earlier ones, less lonely somehow. "Would you like me to help you put it on?" Sarah asked softly. As she fastened the chain around Isabella's neck, Emma watched with interest. "Now you have two special necklaces," she observed, referring to both the locket and Thomas's medallion, "just like you have two special families." The simple wisdom of her daughter's words struck Sarah deeply. She caught Richard's eye, seeing in his expression the same understanding. They weren't just combining families, they were healing old wounds, building something new from the fragments of the past. "Isabella," Richard said carefully, "you don't have to come to the press conference, but I want you to know what I'm going to say." He took a deep breath. "I'm going to tell everyone how proud I am to be your uncle, how Thomas was the best of us because he followed his heart, and how the Bennett family is stronger because you're part of it." Isabella touched her new locket, then reached for the photo album in her lap. After a moment's hesitation, she opened it to the last page, the photo of her with both her parents. Can we show them this?" she asked quietly. "So they know what Mama and Daddy were really like?" Richard glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "If you're sure that's what you want," he said gently. "I am." Isabella's chin lifted in a gesture so reminiscent of Thomas that it made Sarah's heart ache. Mama always said the truth is better than hiding. She was just waiting for the right time to tell it. Emma suddenly jumped up. "We should all wear something blue. Daddy always said blue was for brave people." The suggestion broke the tension, making everyone smile. Even Richard found himself agreeing to wear his blue tie instead of his usual power red. As Mrs. Hudson helped the girls get ready, Sarah pulled Richard aside. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "I found more letters in Maria's journal. Letters she wrote but never sent, after she learned about Thomas's accident." Richard's expression tightened. What did they say? "She knew she was sick," Sarah whispered, her voice catching. "Terminal. She was trying to find the right way to tell Thomas, to make sure Isabella would be taken care of. The timing of everything. It wasn't just cruel coincidence. She was running out of time, and Thomas was racing against a clock he didn't even know existed." The weight of this revelation settled over them as they watched the girls choosing their outfits, Isabella carefully smoothing her new dress, while Emma offered enthusiastic opinions. "We'll tell her when she's older," Richard decided. "When she's ready to understand that sometimes life's greatest tragedies and most beautiful moments are woven from the same threads." Sarah touched her belly, feeling the baby move. "Thomas knew," she said softly. "Somehow, he knew he had to find her, had to make things right. That's why he was so desperate to tell me to fix everything." Through the window, they could see the media gathering at the gates, their cameras and microphones ready to broadcast the Bennett family's latest chapter to the world. But in this quiet moment, watching two sisters help each other with their hair ribbons, both wearing blue for bravery, the outside world seemed very far away. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a tray of breakfast, heart-shaped pancakes, Isabella and Emma's shared favorite. "Mr. Thomas would be proud," she said simply, her eyes glistening. "Of all of you." The Bennett Corporation's press room had never been so crowded. Journalists packed the rows of seats, cameras flashed continuously, and the air hummed with speculation. Richard stood at the podium, his blue tie a stark departure from his usual appearance, while Sarah sat in the front row with the girls. Isabella wore her new locket proudly, one hand clasping it while the other held Emma's hand tightly. The photo album rested in her lap, its edges worn, but its contents precious beyond measure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I've called this press conference not just as CEO of Bennett Corporation, but as a brother, an uncle, and a man who has learned some difficult truths about family and legacy." The room fell silent, cameras continuing to flash as Richard told a story different from what anyone expected. Not a corporate scandal to be managed, but a tale of love, sacrifice, and redemption. 15 years ago, he continued, my brother Thomas fell in love with a remarkable woman named Maria Ramirez. Through my actions and misguided intentions, their love story was interrupted. But love, as I've learned, has a way of finding its path despite our best efforts to redirect it. In the front row, Isabella straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from the locket around her neck and the sister beside her. Sarah reached over, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Today, I stand before you not to manage a crisis, but to right a wrong, to acknowledge my niece Isabella Ramirez Bennett as the daughter of Thomas Bennett and Maria Ramirez, to celebrate the expansion of our family rather than hide it, and to announce the establishment of the Thomas Bennett Foundation, dedicated to supporting single parents and children in need." The press room erupted with questions, but Richard held up his hand. "Before you ask your questions, there's something else you need to see, something that shows the true heart of this story." He gestured to Isabella, who stood slowly, clutching the photo album. Emma rose with her, refusing to let go of her hand. Together they walked to the podium, where Richard lifted Isabella so she could reach the microphone. "My mama and daddy loved each other," Isabella said clearly, her voice carrying through the suddenly silent room. "And they loved me. That's not a scandal. That's just the truth." She opened the photo album, showing the final photo of her with both parents. The image was quickly captured by dozens of cameras, but none could truly capture the love evident in those frozen smiles. A reporter in the front row raised her hand. "Ms. Bennett," she addressed Isabella gently, "how do you feel about joining the Bennett family?" Isabella looked at Emma, then at Sarah before answering. "I already had a family with Mama," she said. "Now I have a bigger one. Daddy always said love multiplies. It doesn't divide. The simple wisdom of her words caused several reporters to drop their professional detachment, wiping away tears. Even the most cynical journalists found themselves moved by the sight of the two sisters standing together, one in a designer dress, one in her first ever new outfit, both wearing blue for bravery. Richard placed a protective hand on Isabella's shoulder. "The Bennett Corporation has always prided itself on family values," he continued. "Today, we're showing what those values truly mean. They mean acknowledging our mistakes, embracing all members of our family, and using our resources to help others who might be facing similar struggles." He outlined the Foundation's initiatives: educational support for single-parent families, medical assistance programs, advocacy for children's rights. With each announcement, the story in the press room shifted from scandal to redemption. Sarah watched from her seat, one hand resting on her belly, feeling the baby move as if in response to the emotions filling the room. She thought of Thomas, of his gentle heart and unfailing kindness, and knew he would be proud of this moment. As the press conference concluded, a small commotion at the back of the room drew everyone's attention. An elderly woman made her way forward, leaning heavily on a cane. Isabella's eyes widened in recognition. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she whispered. The woman had been Maria's neighbor, the one who had helped care for Isabella when her mother was too ill to do so. She approached the podium, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I've been watching the news," she said, her voice trembling. "I had to come. I had to tell you. Maria would be so happy. This is all she ever wanted, for Isabella to be loved, to be part of both her families." Richard stepped forward, taking the woman's hand. "Thank you," he said softly, "for being there when we weren't, for helping take care of our family." The words, "our family," echoed through the room, carrying with them the weight of acceptance, of bridges built across years of separation and misunderstanding. As they left the press room, Isabella riding on Richard's shoulders while Emma skipped alongside them, Sarah noticed something remarkable. The photographers weren't just capturing the obvious shots of the Bennett heir and his newfound niece. They were capturing the small moments. Emma reaching up to hold Isabella's hand, Isabella's locket catching the light, the protective way Richard carried her through the crowd. They were capturing the truth, not the scandal they'd come for, but the story of a family healing, growing, and learning that love, in all its forms, was worth more than any corporate legacy. Outside, the sun had broken through the morning clouds, casting warm light across the city Thomas had loved so much. In that light, Sarah could almost see him smiling, proud of the family that was finally truly complete. The days following the press conference brought unexpected changes to the Bennett household. The media frenzy had transformed into something gentler. Stories of family reconciliation and second chances replaced the initial scandal headlines. Letters and emails poured in from people touched by Isabella's story, many sharing their own tales of lost family connections and renewed hope. Sarah sat in the garden, watching as Mrs. Hudson taught both girls how to plant flowers in the small patch that had once been Thomas's pride and joy. Isabella had chosen blue forget-me-nots, while Emma insisted on bright yellow daisies. The sight of them working together, dirt smudged on their faces and determination in their eyes, made Sarah's heart swell. "They're going to need bigger pots for those," Richard observed, joining her on the garden bench. He had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking more relaxed than Sarah had ever seen him in the middle of a workday. "The foundation office called," he continued, his voice soft enough not to disturb the girls' concentration. "We've already received over 1,000 applications for assistance. Thomas would have loved that, his name helping other families find their way back together." Sarah nodded, touching her belly as the baby kicked particularly hard. "He always said money was only worth what you did with it." She paused, watching Isabella carefully pat soil around a tiny plant. "Have you told her about the trust fund yet?" Richard shook his head. "I wanted to wait until things settled down a bit. Besides, Maria left something more important than money." He pulled out a worn envelope from his jacket pocket. "I found this when I was going through the legal paperwork. It's a letter she wrote to Isabella, to be opened on her 18th birthday." Before they could discuss it further, Emma's excited voice interrupted them. "Look, Our flowers are all planted." The adults moved closer to inspect the girls' handiwork. The flower bed was a cheerful mixture of organized chaos. Emma's daisies scattered randomly, while Isabella's forget-me-nots formed neat rows. Somehow, the combination worked perfectly. "Just like Daddy's garden," Emma declared proudly. "He always said the best gardens have surprises." Isabella touched one of the delicate blue petals. "Mama loved flowers too. She had a tiny window box at our old apartment. Sometimes, when she was feeling really sick, she'd still make sure to water them." The mention of Maria's illness brought a momentary shadow to Isabella's face, but Emma quickly distracted her by suggesting they make signs for each type of flower. Mrs. Hudson disappeared into the house, returning with craft supplies and cookies. As the girls worked on their signs, Richard received a phone call that made him frown. "The board wants to meet again," he said to Sarah after hanging up. "Some of the members are concerned about the foundation's budget allocation." "Go," Sarah said firmly. "We've got things handled here. Besides," she smiled, "I think Mrs. Hudson has plans for the girls to help make dinner tonight." Richard hesitated, watching Isabella carefully letter "forget-me-nots" on a small wooden stake. "I've missed so much," he said quietly. "All those years focused on the company, on what I thought was important." "It's never too late," Sarah reminded him, squeezing his hand. "Thomas taught us that." As Richard left for his meeting, Sarah noticed Isabella watching him go, a thoughtful expression on her young face. "Uncle Richard is different now," she observed. "He smiles more." "People can surprise you," Sarah agreed. "Sometimes they just need a chance to show their true hearts." The afternoon drifted peacefully as the girls tended their garden and worked on their signs. Mrs. Hudson taught them how to make butterfly decorations from painted clothespins, which they planned to add to their flower beds once the paint dried. Later, as they helped prepare dinner, Isabella suddenly asked, "Can we make Mama's special pasta? She always said it was magic because it made everyone happy." Sarah exchanged glances with Mrs. Hudson, who immediately began gathering ingredients. "Of course we can, sweetheart. Why don't you tell us how to make it?" As Isabella directed them in creating Maria's recipe, bow ties with a sauce made from cream, peas, and ham, she seemed to stand taller, more confident. This was something she knew, something she could share from her old life with her new family. Emma proved to be an enthusiastic assistant, carefully measuring ingredients and stirring the sauce with intense concentration. "We should write this recipe down," she suggested. "Put it in the special cookbook with all of Daddy's favorites." The suggestion brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Thomas had started the family cookbook years ago, insisting that memories were best preserved through the meals that brought people together. The thought of adding Maria's recipe to those pages felt right, another thread weaving their families closer together. As they worked, Isabella shared stories about cooking with her mother, how Maria would sing Spanish lullabies while stirring, how she'd taught Isabella to tell if pasta was done by throwing a piece at the wall. "It sticks if it's ready." How they'd make up silly names for their culinary experiments. When Richard returned from his meeting, looking tired but satisfied, he found them all in the kitchen. The air was filled with the aroma of Maria's pasta sauce, the sound of girlish laughter, and the warmth of family connections growing stronger. "Perfect timing," Sarah smiled, noting his loosened tie and rolled sleeves. "We're just about to test if the pasta's ready. Isabella has a special technique to show us." As they watched Isabella demonstrate the wall-throwing method, much to Mrs. Hudson's carefully hidden dismay, Richard's phone buzzed with another board-related message. This time, he simply turned it off. "Some things," he said, accepting a piece of test pasta from Isabella, "are more important than business meetings." The evening concluded with a family dinner that bridged past and present. Maria's pasta served on the Bennett family's fine china, stories of both families shared over candlelight, and plans for tomorrow's garden tending discussed with serious enthusiasm by two sisters who had found each other against all odds. As Sarah tucked the girls into bed later that night, she noticed Isabella holding both her necklaces, the locket and the medallion. "They tell our whole story," Isabella explained sleepily, "about how love finds a way to bring families together." Sarah kissed both girls goodnight, then paused in the doorway watching them drift off to sleep. Through the window, she could see the newly planted garden, its small signs standing guard over the sleeping flowers. Tomorrow, those plants would grow a little stronger, reach a little higher, just like the family tending them. The first day of school loomed before them like a mountain to be climbed. Isabella stood in front of her new bedroom mirror, adjusting her uniform tie for the 10th time, while Emma bounced impatiently in the doorway. The prestigious Bennett Academy had never seemed more intimidating than it did this morning. "You look perfect," Sarah assured her, helping to smooth down a rebellious strand of hair. "And remember, Emma will be just down the hall if you need anything." Isabella touched her locket, then the medallion, a gesture that had become her way of gathering courage. "What if the other kids?" She trailed off, unable to voice her fears. "Then they'll have to deal with me," Emma declared firmly, her own uniform slightly rumpled from her energetic morning routine, "because that's what sisters do." The word sisters still had the power to bring smiles to both girls' faces. Over the past few weeks, they had grown closer than anyone could have expected, their different personalities complementing each other perfectly. Richard appeared in the doorway, car keys in hand. "Ready for the grand adventure?" He had insisted on driving the girls to school himself, rearranging his entire morning schedule to be present for this important moment. The drive to school was filled with Emma's cheerful chatter about her favorite teachers and the best spots on the playground. Isabella listened intently, her hand never straying far from her necklaces. As they pulled up to the school's impressive entrance, Richard noticed Isabella's apprehension. "You know," he said casually, "your father was nervous on his first day here too, but he found his own way to make this place special." "Really?" both girls asked in unison. Richard smiled, remembering. "He started a garden club, said the school needed more flowers and fewer rules. The garden he and his students planted is still there behind the science building." Isabella's eyes lit up. "Can we see it?" They had arrived early enough for a small detour. Richard led them around the building to a secluded courtyard where flowers bloomed in cheerful profusion. A small plaque read, "The Bennett Memorial Garden, where dreams take root." "I didn't know this was Daddy's," Emma whispered, touching the plaque gently. "It was his way of making his mark," Richard explained. "Not through grades or sports, but by creating something beautiful that everyone could enjoy." Isabella knelt to examine a cluster of forget-me-nots, similar to the ones she had planted at home. "They're just like ours," she said softly. "Because someone's been tending them with love," Sarah observed. "Just like you girls tend your garden at home." The first bell rang, sending students hurrying to their classrooms. Emma grabbed Isabella's hand. "Come on. Mrs. Parker's class is this way, and she's the nicest teacher ever." As the girls hurried off, Sarah leaned against Richard's arm, fighting back tears. "They'll be fine," she said, as much to convince herself as him. "Of course they will," Richard agreed, watching until the girls disappeared inside. "They're Bennetts, after all, both of them." The day passed in a blur of nervous energy for those waiting at home. Sarah tried to focus on her work. She had started writing children's stories inspired by the girls' adventures, but found herself checking the clock every few minutes. Mrs. Hudson baked enough cookies to feed an army, claiming the kitchen helped her think of other things. When Richard's car finally pulled up in the afternoon, both girls tumbled out chattering excitedly. Isabella's earlier nervousness had disappeared, replaced by animated enthusiasm. "Mrs. Parker, let me tell the class about our garden at home," she announced as they entered the house. "And then Billy Jenkins said his mom read about us in the newspaper and that it was really cool how families can find each other even after a long time." Emma nodded vigorously. "And at recess, we showed everyone Daddy's garden, and Isabella knew all the flower names in Spanish too." "It sounds like you both had quite a day," Sarah smiled, helping them with their book bags. "Why don't you change clothes and then tell us all about it over Mrs. Hudson's cookies?" As the girls raced upstairs, Richard loosened his tie with a contented sigh. "Thomas would have loved this," he said quietly. Seeing them together, sharing his love of growing things. Sarah touched her belly, feeling the baby's familiar movements. "He sees it," she said softly. "Somehow I know he does." The rest of the afternoon was spent listening to detailed accounts of the day's adventures, from the fascinating contents of lunchboxes to the important business of playground alliances. Isabella had already made several friends, drawn to her quiet confidence and knowledge of flowers, while Emma had proudly introduced her new sister to her entire social circle. Later, as the girls did their homework at the kitchen table, Isabella suddenly looked up. "Can we write to Mama too?" she asked. "Tell her about my first day." Sarah and Richard exchanged glances, understanding the depth of emotion behind the question. "Of course we can, sweetheart," Sarah said. "Why don't we start a journal? We can write letters to both her and Daddy, telling them all about our days." Emma's face lit up. "Like a family newspaper. We can put pictures in it too." That evening, they started the first entry in what would become known as the Bennett Family Chronicles. Isabella carefully wrote about her first day at school, while Emma added colorful illustrations. Sarah contributed a note about how proud both parents would be, and Richard, in an uncharacteristically emotional moment, wrote about learning to see the world through new eyes. As they gathered for dinner, the journal occupying a place of honor on the sideboard, Isabella looked around at her expanded family. "You know what?" she said thoughtfully. "I think Mama and Daddy planned this all along." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Sarah asked. "They knew we'd all find each other," Isabella explained, her young face serious. "That's why they left us all the clues, the medallion, the letters, the garden. They were making a path for us to follow so we could become a real family." Emma nodded sagely. "Like a treasure map, but the treasure was us." The simple wisdom of their children's words brought tears to the adults' eyes. Richard reached over and squeezed Isabella's hand. "I think you might be right," he said softly. "Your parents were always wiser than the rest of us." Autumn painted the garden in rich golds and crimsons as Sarah sat in her favorite spot, watching the girls tend to their flowers. 3 months had passed since Isabella's first day at school, and the changes in their family were as visible as the changing seasons. The baby was due any day now, and the anticipation filled the house with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. "Mom!" Emma called out, her hands covered in dirt. "Isabella found something special in the garden." Sarah carefully made her way to where the girls were kneeling beside their flower bed. Isabella held up a small, tarnished object she had unearthed while planting bulbs for spring. It was a key, old and ornate, its design reminiscent of another era. "It looks like it belongs in a fairy tale," Isabella said, carefully cleaning it with her gardening apron. Mrs. Hudson, who had been supervising the gardening session, approached with interest. "Oh my," she exclaimed softly. "I haven't seen that key in years. It belongs to Mr. Thomas's old treehouse." Both girls' eyes widened with excitement. "Daddy had a treehouse?" Emma asked, looking around the vast garden as if expecting to spot it immediately. "Indeed he did," Mrs. Hudson smiled, pointing to a massive oak tree at the far end of the property. "It's still there, though no one's been up in years. Mr. Thomas used to say he was saving it for his children." Isabella clutched the key tighter, sharing a meaningful look with Emma. Sarah recognized that look. It was the same one Thomas would get when he was about to embark on a new project. "Can we restore it?" Isabella asked hopefully. "Make it special again like we did with the garden." Before Sarah could respond, Richard's voice came from behind them. "I think that's a wonderful idea." He had been working from home more often lately, his priorities shifting as subtly as the autumn leaves. The girls rushed to show him their discovery, explaining their vision for the treehouse renovation. Richard listened intently, his expression softening as memories of childhood adventures with Thomas surfaced. "You know," he said, examining the key, "Thomas and I spent countless hours up there when we were young. He had this idea that it was more than just a treehouse. He called it our thinking spot. Said sometimes you need to climb above everything to see things clearly." Sarah watched as Richard's eyes grew distant with memory. "The last time I was up there was the day before I sent Maria away," he admitted quietly, ensuring only Sarah could hear. "Thomas found me there, trying to convince myself I was doing the right thing for everyone." The girls, oblivious to the weight of Richard's words, were already planning their renovation project. Emma was describing a pulley system for sending up supplies, while Isabella suggested they could plant climbing roses around the trunk. "We'll need to have it inspected first," Richard said, pulling himself back to the present. "Make sure everything's structurally sound, but after that," he smiled at the girls' eager faces, It's all yours to restore." The next few days were filled with activity as the treehouse project took shape. A professional inspector declared the basic structure sound, needing only minor repairs. Richard found himself spending his lunch breaks helping the girls sand rough spots and replace old boards, his expensive suits forgotten in favor of comfortable work clothes. Isabella proved to have an eye for detail, carefully documenting every step of the renovation in the Bennett family chronicles. She included pressed leaves from the oak tree and detailed drawings of their improvements, along with stories Mrs. Hudson shared about Thomas's childhood adventures. One afternoon, while taking a break from their work, Isabella asked Richard about the treehouse's original construction. "Did you and Daddy build it yourselves?" Richard shook his head, settling onto one of the garden benches. "Our father built it for us. He wasn't around much, always busy with the company, but he spent an entire weekend putting this together. It was the longest time we'd ever spent with him." Emma, who had been arranging their tool collection, looked up with interest. "What was Grandpa like?" Richard was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "He was complicated, very focused on success and the family name. But there were moments like when he built this treehouse, when he showed a different side of himself. Like you," Isabella said softly, surprising everyone. When Richard looked questioningly at her, she explained, "You were all about business too, but now you help us with projects and listen to our stories, and even got your clothes dirty helping fix the treehouse." The simple observation struck Richard deeply. Before he could respond, Sarah's voice called out from the house with unusual urgency. "Richard, girls, it's time." They found Sarah in the kitchen, one hand gripping the counter, the other resting on her belly. Mrs. Hudson was already calling the doctor while gathering the pre-packed hospital bag. "The baby's coming," Emma asked excitedly, while Isabella stood slightly apart, uncertainty crossing her face. Sarah reached out to both girls. "That's right, sweethearts. Your new sister or brother is ready to meet everyone." "Both of us?" Isabella asked hesitantly. "I can come too." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Hudson said firmly, already herding them toward the car. "Your family." The drive to the hospital was a blur of excitement and nervous energy. The girls held hands in the back seat, whispering their hopes for their new sibling. Richard managed to maintain his usual calm demeanor, though his white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel betrayed his anxiety. As they settled into the hospital's waiting room, Isabella pulled out the Bennett family chronicles from her ever-present backpack. "We should write about this," she declared. "It's an important family moment." Emma nodded enthusiastically, helping her sister document everything from the excitement of the announcement to the color of the hospital walls. Richard watched them work together, marveling at how naturally they had become a team. Hours passed as they waited for news. Mrs. Hudson arrived with sandwiches and stories to keep the girls entertained. As evening approached, both girls curled up together on one of the waiting room couches, their heads close together as they added more details to their chronicle. Finally, a nurse appeared with the news they'd been waiting for. Richard gently woke the girls, and they all followed her to Sarah's room. There, looking tired but radiant, Sarah held a tiny bundle. "Girls," she said softly, "come meet your brother." As they approached the bed, Isabella hesitated again until Sarah reached out and drew her closer. "Thomas," she said, looking at her newborn son, "meet your big sisters." Richard's breath caught at the name, and Mrs. Hudson dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. The baby opened his eyes, seemingly studying each face in turn. "He has Daddy's eyes," Emma whispered in awe. "And Mama's smile," Isabella added softly, touching the baby's tiny hand with gentle wonder. In that moment, as they gathered around the newest member of their family, the past and present seemed to merge. Through all the pain and separation, love had found a way to bring them together, to heal old wounds and to create something beautiful and new. "Welcome to the family, little Thomas," Isabella whispered, opening the chronicles to a fresh page. "We have so many stories to tell you." The nursery had become the heart of the Bennett household, its walls adorned with family photos that told a story of love transcending time and circumstance. Baby Thomas, now 6 weeks old, lay in his crib while his sisters entertained him with shadow puppets in the soft afternoon light. "Look, Tommy," Emma giggled, creating a butterfly shape with her hands. "This is like the ones in our garden." Isabella added her own creation, a flower that seemed to bloom and fade as she moved her fingers. The baby watched with wide-eyed fascination, his tiny hands reaching toward the dancing shadows on the wall. Sarah stood in the doorway, taking in the scene with a full heart. The past months had brought so many changes, yet somehow everything felt right, as if all the pieces of their family puzzle had finally found their proper places. "Mrs. Bennet?" Mrs. Hudson appeared beside her, holding a dusty box. "The workers found this while repairing the treehouse roof. I think you should see it." Sarah followed the housekeeper to the study, where Richard was already waiting. The box, when opened, revealed a collection of treasures that brought tears to their eyes: Thomas's childhood journal, photographs of him with Maria in their youth, and letters he had written but never sent. "He kept everything up there," Richard said softly, lifting out a faded photograph of Thomas and Maria at their high school graduation. His own private archive of memories. Among the items was a sealed envelope with Isabella's name written in Thomas's familiar handwriting. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the seal remained unbroken. "Should we give it to her?" Sarah asked, handling the envelope carefully. Richard nodded slowly. "I think it's time. She's shown such strength these past months. She's ready." They called the girls down from the nursery, Mrs. Hudson staying behind to watch baby Thomas. Isabella's eyes widened when she saw the box and its contents spread across Thomas's desk. "Your father," Richard began, his voice gentle, "kept these things in the treehouse. Special memories he wanted to preserve. And this," he handed her the envelope, "he wrote for you." Isabella took the envelope with trembling hands, her locket and medallion catching the light as she moved. Emma sat close beside her, offering silent support as her sister carefully broke the seal. "My dearest Isabella," she read aloud, her voice clear despite her emotion. "I'm writing this letter on the day I first learned about you. My heart is so full of love and regret. Love for the wonderful daughter you are. Regret for all the years I missed. But mostly, I'm filled with hope for the future we'll build together. By the time you read this, I hope you'll be part of our family in every way. I dream of you and Emma growing up as sisters, sharing secrets and adventures like Richard and I once did. I dream of you knowing Sarah's kindness and understanding. Most of all, I dream of you knowing how deeply you are loved, by your mother, by me, and by the family we'll become. The medallion you now wear was given to me by my father on a day when I felt lost and uncertain. He told me it would help me find my way home. Now I give it to you, knowing that home isn't just a place, it's the people who love us, the memories we share, and the bonds that connect us across time and distance. Your mother, Maria, was one of the bravest people I've ever known. She faced every challenge with grace and strength, qualities I see in you every day. Keep her memory close, just as you'll learn to keep your new family close. Love doesn't divide when we share it. It grows stronger, like the gardens we tend together. Above all, remember that you are a Bennet in the truest sense, not because of a name or a legacy, but because of your capacity to love, to forgive, and to bring light into the lives of others. With all my love, Dad." The study was quiet when Isabella finished reading, broken only by soft sniffles as everyone wiped away tears. Emma had her arm around her sister's shoulders, their heads leaning together in a gesture that had become natural over the months. "There's something else," Richard said, reaching into the box. He pulled out a small notebook, its pages filled with pressed flowers. "Your father and mother made this together during their senior year. Each flower marks a special moment they shared." Isabella opened the notebook carefully. Between its pages, she found forget-me-nots, daisies, and roses, each accompanied by dates and small notes, in both Thomas's and Maria's handwriting. "The flowers in Daddy's garden," Emma realized. "They're the same ones." Sarah smiled through her tears. "He planted them as a reminder of love that never fades, just like the ones you girls planted together." A cry from upstairs interrupted the moment, baby Thomas announcing that he was awake and wanted attention. The girls immediately jumped up, eager to share this new discovery with their baby brother. "We should add these to the chronicles," Isabella said, as they headed upstairs. "Tommy needs to know all the stories when he's bigger." Richard watched them go, then turned to Sarah. "Thomas would be proud of them, of all of us." "He is," Sarah said softly, touching the pressed flowers in the notebook. Every time the girls laugh together, every time Isabella shares a memory of Maria, every time we add to the chronicles, he's there, watching his dreams for this family come true. From upstairs came the sound of girlish laughter, mixed with a baby's happy coos. In the garden, the autumn wind rustled through the old oak tree, its branches embracing the newly restored treehouse where so many memories had been preserved. And in the study, surrounded by tangible pieces of the past, Sarah and Richard understood that Thomas had given them one final gift, the chance to build a future where love knew no boundaries and family meant everyone who held a piece of their hearts. The first snowfall of December transformed the Bennett estate into a winter wonderland. Christmas was approaching, and with it came a bittersweet mixture of joy and remembrance. The grand house was already decorated for the season, with Mrs. Hudson orchestrating the placement of every garland and ornament with military precision. In the main living room, Isabella and Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by boxes of old Christmas ornaments. Each decoration they pulled out seemed to come with its own story, which Emma eagerly shared with her sister. "This one," Emma said, carefully lifting a handmade star, "Daddy helped me make when I was really little. We used all this glitter, and it got everywhere." She giggled at the memory, then noticed Isabella's quiet expression. "Did you and your mama have special decorations too?" Isabella nodded, reaching for her ever-present backpack. She pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package. "We had a tiny tree," she said softly. "But Mama made it magical. She created these herself." She unwrapped the package to reveal delicate paper snowflakes, each one intricately cut and decorated with small Spanish phrases. "They're beautiful," Sarah said from the doorway, baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Would you like to hang them on our tree?" Isabella's eyes widened. "Really? You wouldn't mind mixing them with your fancy ornaments?" "Mind?" Richard appeared behind Sarah, his suit jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up. "I think they're exactly what our tree needs. In fact," he moved to his briefcase and pulled out a folder, "I have something that might go perfectly with them." From the folder, he produced several photographs that had been carefully restored. They showed Maria and Thomas at various Christmas celebrations during their high school years, decorating the school's holiday display, singing in the choir, sharing quiet moments under mistletoe. "I found these in the treehouse box," Richard explained. "I had them restored so we could frame them." Isabella took the photos with trembling hands, her eyes drinking in the sight of her parents' young, happy faces. Emma leaned in close, studying the images with intense interest. "Daddy looks so young," she exclaimed, "and Isabella's mama is so pretty. She has the same smile as Isabella." Sarah settled into a nearby chair, adjusting baby Thomas as he stirred. "Why don't we create a special section of the tree?" she suggested. "We can hang Maria's snowflakes and these photos together, make it a celebration of all our family memories." The idea sparked enthusiasm in both girls. They spent the next hour carefully arranging the snowflakes and photos, with Mrs. Hudson providing ribbon to frame each picture. As they worked, Isabella shared stories about the Christmases she'd spent with Maria, how they would make hot chocolate with cinnamon, sing carols in Spanish and English, and read stories by candlelight when money was too tight for elaborate decorations. "Your mother had a gift for making simple things special," Richard observed, helping to hang a particularly delicate snowflake. Thomas was like that too. He could turn an ordinary moment into something magical. "Like the Christmas Eve picnic," Emma bounced excitedly. "Daddy would spread blankets right here in the living room, and we'd eat dinner under the tree lights." Isabella's eyes lit up at the idea. "Could we do that this year, with all of us?" "I think that's a wonderful tradition to continue," Sarah smiled, watching baby Thomas's tiny hand reach toward the twinkling lights. "And maybe we could add some of your mother's traditions too. The hot chocolate with cinnamon sounds perfect for a picnic." As the afternoon progressed, the tree became a beautiful blend of old and new, elegant and homemade, English and Spanish. Mrs. Hudson appeared with actual hot chocolate and cinnamon, made from Maria's recipe that Isabella remembered by heart. "There's one more thing," Richard said as they all settled with their drinks. He retrieved another package from his briefcase. "I had this made special for this year." Inside was a new ornament, a delicate glass globe containing what appeared to be a miniature garden. Tiny forget-me-nots and daisies bloomed eternally inside, and around the base were engraved the words, "The Bennett family, love grows." "It's enchanted," Emma gasped, while Isabella traced the flowers with a gentle finger. "It's our garden," she whispered. "The one we planted together." Richard handed the ornament to the girls. "Would you like to hang it together, right in the center?" As they carefully placed the ornament in a place of honor, baby Thomas awoke with a happy gurgle. The tree lights reflected in his eyes as he took in the scene before him. His sisters working together, his parents watching proudly, Mrs. Hudson discreetly wiping away tears. "You know what?" Isabella said thoughtfully, stepping back to admire their work. "I think this is exactly what both my parents wanted, all of us together, making new memories while keeping the old ones alive." Emma nodded solemnly. "It's like the garden in the snow outside. Even when you can't see the flowers, you know they're there, waiting to bloom again." Sarah and Richard exchanged glances, touched by their daughter's wisdom. The room felt full of presence, not just of those gathered there, but of Thomas and Maria too, their love living on in the blending of traditions and the sharing of memories. As evening fell, Mrs. Hudson brought out more hot chocolate and Christmas cookies. The family gathered close, sharing stories and plans for the holiday ahead. Baby Thomas was passed from lap to lap, his eyes wide with wonder at the twinkling lights and shining ornaments. "Mama would have loved this," Isabella said softly, cuddled between Emma and Sarah. "She always said Christmas was when magic felt closest." "She was right," Richard replied, watching the snow fall outside. "And the magic doesn't come from the decorations or presents. It comes from moments like this, when family comes together and love fills every corner of the room." They stayed there until late, their hearts as warm as their cocoa, while outside the snow continued to fall, covering the garden in a blanket of white possibility. The house was quiet in the pre-dawn hours of Christmas Eve, save for the soft cooing sounds coming from the nursery. Isabella sat in the rocking chair beside baby Thomas's crib, speaking to him in gentle whispers, as she had done many nights since his birth. "Today's going to be special, Tommy," she murmured, reaching through the crib bars to hold his tiny hand. "It's our first Christmas all together, and I want to tell you about the people who made it possible." The baby gurgled in response, his fingers wrapping instinctively around his sister's. Down the hall, Emma slept soundly, while Sarah and Richard's room remained peacefully silent. "See these?" Isabella touched her necklaces, the locket and medallion catching the soft nightlight's glow. "They're like keys to our family story. The medallion is from our daddy, and the locket has pictures of both my mamas in it now, my first mama, Maria, and Sarah, who loves me just as much." She had started these nighttime talks shortly after Thomas was born, feeling a special connection to her baby brother during these quiet moments. Sometimes she told him stories about Maria, other times about Thomas, and sometimes she just shared her thoughts about their growing family. A floorboard creaked softly, and Isabella looked up to find Mrs. Hudson in the doorway, wrapped in her robe. "Couldn't sleep, dear?" the housekeeper asked kindly, entering the nursery with 2 steaming mugs of warm milk with honey, their secret midnight ritual. Isabella accepted her mug gratefully. "I was telling Tommy about my special Christmas tradition with Mama. We used to wake up really early on Christmas Eve and watch the sunrise together. She said it was the moment when wishes had the most power." Mrs. Hudson settled into the other rocking chair, her eyes soft with understanding. "Would you like to watch the sunrise this morning? I believe there's a perfect view from the treehouse." The suggestion brought a smile to Isabella's face. "Could we? It won't be too cold for Tommy." "We'll bundle him up properly," Mrs. Hudson assured her. "I'll let Sarah know, she's already awake feeding him anyway." Within half an hour, a small group had assembled in the treehouse. Sarah holding a well-wrapped Thomas, Isabella and Emma sharing a thick blanket, and Mrs. Hudson providing thermoses of hot chocolate. To everyone's surprise, Richard appeared as well, having heard the quiet preparations. "Your father and I used to do this too," he told the girls as they waited for the sun. "Watch the Christmas Eve sunrise from up here. Thomas always said it was the moment when past and present touched." As the sky began to lighten, Isabella closed her eyes and made her wish, just as she had done with Maria every year. When she opened them, she found Emma watching her curiously. "What did you wish for?" her sister whispered. Isabella smiled, looking around at her family gathered in the early morning light. "I wished for exactly this," she said softly. "For all of us to be together." The sun broke over the horizon, painting the snow-covered garden in shades of pink and gold. Baby Thomas made a delighted sound. His tiny face turned toward the light as if he understood the magic of the moment. "Look," Emma pointed suddenly. "The garden." The rising sun had created an extraordinary effect in their flower bed. The snow covering their carefully tended plants sparkled like diamonds, and where it had melted slightly, hints of green showed through. Proof that life continued beneath the winter blanket. "Your father would have loved this," Sarah said, adjusting Thomas in her arms. "He always said the best gifts were the ones nature gave us." Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He taught me that too, though it took me many years to understand. Some presents can't be wrapped or bought. Like family," Isabella said quietly, holding her medallion, "and memories." As they watched the sun rise fully over their winter garden, each lost in their own thoughts, Baby Thomas reached out toward his sisters, making the insistent noises they had learned meant he wanted attention. "I think he wants to help decorate for tonight's picnic," Emma decided, as they carefully made their way back down from the treehouse. The rest of the day was filled with preparation for their Christmas Eve celebration. The girls helped Mrs. Hudson prepare special dishes, including Maria's cinnamon hot chocolate and Thomas's favorite Christmas cookies. Sarah and Richard worked together to arrange blankets and pillows in the living room, creating a cozy space under the tree. As evening approached, Isabella retreated briefly to her room. From her special box of treasures, she removed 2 carefully wrapped packages she had prepared weeks ago. One contained a framed pressing of forget-me-nots from their garden, arranged to spell out family. The other held a handmade book filled with pressed flowers, modeled after the one Thomas and Maria had created, but featuring flowers and memories from their new shared life. When she returned to the living room, she found everyone already gathered for the picnic. Baby Thomas lay on a soft blanket, fascinated by the twinkling lights above him. Emma was arranging pillows with careful precision, while Sarah and Richard set out the feast on a low table. "Before we start," Isabella said shyly, holding out her packages, "I made something for our chronicles." The family gathered close as she presented her gifts. Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the spelled-out flowers, while Richard carefully turned each page of the memory book, touching the pressed blooms with gentle fingers. "It's perfect," Emma declared, snuggling close to her sister. "It's all our stories together." As they settled in for their Christmas Eve picnic, sharing food and stories under the twinkling lights, Isabella felt a sense of completion she had never known before. The tree above them sparkled with old and new decorations, Maria's snowflakes dancing among the Bennett family heirlooms. Baby Thomas dozed contentedly in Sarah's arms, while Richard and Mrs. Hudson debated the perfect cookie-to-hot chocolate ratio. In that moment, Isabella understood what her father had meant about magic being closest at Christmas. It wasn't in the presents or decorations, it was in the way love could build bridges across time, healing old wounds and creating new bonds that were stronger than any sadness. She touched her necklaces one more time, sending a silent thank you to both her parents for leading her to this moment. This family, this love that continued to grow and bloom, even in the depths of winter. January arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and new challenges for the Bennett family. Baby Thomas was growing rapidly, his personality emerging more each day. The family had settled into a comfortable rhythm, but change was in the air as Richard prepared for an important announcement at the foundation. Downstairs, Sarah was coordinating with Mrs. Hudson to ensure everything was perfect for the party. Baby Thomas, now 9 months old, watched from his playpen, occasionally contributing happy squeals to the conversation. "The first guests will be arriving soon," Mrs. Hudson noted, checking her list. "Mrs. Rodriguez is bringing her famous empanadas, and the foundation families are all coming with dishes to share. Richard appeared from his study, for once dressed casually in khakis and a blue button-down shirt. "The garden looks amazing," he reported. "The children from the school program did a wonderful job with their section." The Foundation's school garden program had been a tremendous success, with dozens of schools now participating. Each school created its own unique garden, but all included elements inspired by Thomas and Maria's story. Forget-me-nots and marigolds growing side by side, bridges made of flowering vines, paths that connected different cultural plantings. As the girls descended the stairs with their mysterious package, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived first, bringing not only her promised empanadas, but also a special gift, Maria's old recipe book, which she had kept safe all these years. "I think it's time you had this," she told Isabella, her eyes misting. "Your mama would want you to have all her special recipes to share with your new family." More guests arrived, families helped by the foundation, teachers from the school garden program, even some of Richard's board members who had become personally invested in the foundation's mission. The garden filled with laughter and conversation in multiple languages, exactly as Thomas had envisioned in his plans. In a quiet moment between greeting guests, Richard found Isabella standing by the forget-me-not path to the treehouse. "Your parents would be so proud of everything you've helped create here," he said softly. Isabella smiled, touching her necklaces. "I think they knew it would happen like this. That's why they left us all the clues to find each other." "You know," Richard said thoughtfully, "I used to think success was about building things that would last forever. Buildings, companies, fortunes. But your father and mother understood that the most lasting things we build are the connections between people." Their conversation was interrupted by Emma calling everyone to gather around the main garden table. "We have something to share," she announced, as Isabella brought forward their scrapbook. The family settled on blankets and chairs, baby Thomas crawling from lap to lap as the girls began to present their project. Each page told part of their story: newspaper clippings from that first dramatic day at the funeral, photos of their early gardening attempts, pressed flowers from significant moments, and quotes from the Bennett family chronicles. "But the most special part," Isabella said, turning to the final pages, "is this." She revealed a collection of letters from people whose lives had been touched by their family's story. There were notes from school children tending their first gardens, from single parents who had received foundation help, from people inspired to reconnect with their own lost family members. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she read the letters. "This is beautiful, girls. You've shown how love really does multiply when it's shared." Richard was particularly moved by a letter from a business colleague who had been inspired to start a similar foundation in another city. "Your father always said one act of kindness could change the world," he said. He was right. As the afternoon progressed, Mrs. Hudson brought out a special cake she had made for the occasion. Decorated with fondant flowers that matched their garden, it bore a simple message: "Love grows here." Baby Thomas, sitting in Sarah's lap, reached for the cake with determination, causing everyone to laugh. His personality grew more evident each day. He had Thomas's gentle smile, Maria's expressive eyes, and a curiosity about everything that kept his family constantly on their toes. "Time for a toast," Richard announced, raising his glass. "To family, not just those connected by blood or name, but all those connected by love. To the gardeners who taught us that the most beautiful things take time and patience to grow, and to the children who remind us every day that hope blooms in the most unexpected places." As glasses clinked and more stories were shared, Isabella and Emma slipped away to the treehouse for a moment of quiet. From their perch they could see the entire garden, full of life, color, and people whose lives had been changed by their family's story. "Do you think," Emma asked softly, "that Daddy and your mama can see all this?" Isabella touched her medallion and locket, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I think they've been helping us all along," she replied. "Every flower that blooms, every new person who finds hope in our garden, it's all part of their love story." Below them, baby Thomas's laugh rang out across the garden, a sound of pure joy that seemed to make the flowers bend toward him in response. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the paths and gardens that had become so much more than just plants and flowers. They had become bridges between past and present, between different cultures and experiences, between people who might never have connected otherwise. In that golden moment, as butterfly shadows danced across the flowers and the air filled with the mingled scents of blooms from around the world, the Bennett family's garden stood as a living testament to the power of love to grow, change, and create new life from what appeared to be endings. The late summer evening wrapped the Bennett estate in a gentle warmth as the family gathered in the treehouse for what had become a cherished tradition, their weekly sky story time. Baby Thomas, now adept at crawling and pulling himself up, sat securely in Sarah's lap, while Isabella and Emma took turns reading from the Bennett family chronicles. And then, Emma read dramatically, the forget-me-nots made a path right to the treehouse, like they were showing us the way home. Isabella smiled at the memory, touching her lockets as she often did when thinking of her parents. The past year had brought so many changes, yet some things remained beautifully constant. The love that bound them together, the gardens that kept growing, and the stories that helped them remember. Richard, who had made it home early specifically for this family time, sat with his back against the treehouse wall, his usual business attire replaced by comfortable clothes that showed traces of dirt from helping in the garden earlier. "I have something to share," he said during a pause in the reading. From his pocket, he pulled out an old folded piece of paper. "I found this in some of Thomas's old files at the office today." The paper, when carefully unfolded, revealed a letter written by Thomas just days before the accident. It was addressed to my family and had never been sent. Sarah took a deep breath before reading it aloud. "My dearest ones, life has a way of teaching us its most important lessons when we least expect them. I've learned that family isn't just about blood or names. It's about the love we choose to give and the connections we nurture. Isabella, my precious daughter, finding you and your mother again showed me that love never truly goes away. It just waits for the right moment to bloom. Emma, my sweet girl, your open heart and ready acceptance of others reminds me daily of what really matters. Sarah, my love, your strength and compassion make everything possible. Richard, my brother, I've watched you begin to understand what I've always known, that true wealth isn't counted in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. I have dreams for all of you. I dream of gardens growing, of children laughing, of families finding hope in the legacy we'll build together. Most of all, I dream of you all supporting each other, learning from each other, and helping love multiply in ways I may never see, but can already imagine. Remember that every flower that blooms in our garden carries a message. Love grows, changes, and finds its way home, no matter how long the journey. With all my heart, Thomas." The treehouse was quiet when Sarah finished reading, save for baby Thomas's soft babbling as he played with Isabella's necklaces. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and pink, creating an almost magical atmosphere. "Daddy knew," Emma said softly. "He knew we'd all be together like this." Isabella nodded, wiping away tears. "Both my parents knew. They planted the seeds for all of this, the garden, the foundation, our family." Richard cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. "They taught me the most important lesson of all, that it's never too late to change, to grow, to open your heart to new possibilities." Sarah hugged baby Thomas closer as he began to drift off to sleep, content in the warmth of his family's presence. "And now we get to continue their work," she said, "growing gardens, helping others, sharing their story of love and hope." As darkness began to fall, the family made their way back to the house. The garden below was filled with the gentle glow of solar lights, another of Isabella's ideas, inspired by the stories Maria used to tell about stars falling into gardens at night. Emma suddenly stopped on the treehouse ladder. "Look," she whispered excitedly. A family of fireflies had appeared, their gentle lights dancing among the flowers. Baby Thomas awakened just enough to reach toward them with wondering eyes, his delighted gurgle echoing in the peaceful evening air. "Make a wish," Isabella said, remembering her mother's teachings about magical moments. As they watched the fireflies dance, each member of the Bennett family made their own silent wish. But later, as they shared evening hot chocolate, still made according to Maria's recipe, they realized their wishes were all variations of the same thing: to keep growing together, to keep sharing love, to keep building bridges between hearts. Mrs. Hudson, bringing out a plate of cookies, smiled at the scene before her. Richard teaching the girls to play chess, Sarah nursing baby Thomas, the Bennett family chronicles open on the table, its pages ready for new stories to be added. "Your parents," she said softly to Isabella, "planted a garden of love that will never stop growing." Isabella touched her necklaces one final time that evening, feeling the combined weight of the medallion and locket against her heart. "And we'll keep tending it," she replied, "for all the families still finding their way home." Outside, the fireflies continued their dance among the flowers, their lights like tiny stars fallen to earth, illuminating paths of possibility in the growing darkness. The Bennett garden stood as a testament to love's enduring power, to heal, to transform, and to create something beautiful from life's unexpected turns. Autumn painted the Bennett garden in vibrant hues once again as the family prepared for another milestone. The Thomas and Maria Bennett Foundation was hosting its first annual garden festival, bringing together all the schools and families who had been part of their growing community. Early morning light filtered through the changing leaves as Isabella stood before her mirror, carefully pinning a corsage of forget-me-nots and marigolds to her dress. Emma sat on the bed behind her, already wearing her matching flowers, swinging her legs as she reviewed their presentation notes. "Do you think we're ready?" Isabella asked, adjusting her necklaces so they lay perfectly alongside the flowers. "Of course we are," Emma declared with characteristic confidence. "We've been practicing forever, and everyone loves our garden story." Downstairs, Sarah was multitasking, feeding baby Thomas his breakfast while coordinating with Mrs. Hudson about the day's arrangements. At 10 months old, Thomas was becoming quite the personality, his babbling now including clear attempts at words like garden and flower. Richard entered the kitchen, already dressed in his ceremonial best, but with his tablet in hand, reviewing the day's schedule. "The first buses from the partner schools will arrive in an hour," he reported, "and the media team is already setting up in the main garden." The Foundation's garden festival had grown from a simple idea into something extraordinary. Schools from across the city would be showcasing their gardens, sharing stories of how growing things had changed their communities. There would be cultural performances, cooking demonstrations using garden-grown ingredients, and educational workshops for families interested in starting their own gardens. "The weather's perfect," Sarah observed, wiping pureed carrots from Thomas's cheerful face. "Just like it was that first day in our garden." The memory brought smiles to everyone's faces. So much had changed since those first tentative plantings, not just in their garden, but in their hearts and lives as well. As the girls came downstairs, Mrs. Hudson presented them with a surprise. Special gardening aprons she had made, each embroidered with forget-me-nots and their names. On the pocket of each apron was a subtle heart formed by tiny marigolds. "For today's demonstrations," she explained, helping them put the aprons on over their dresses, "and for all your future gardening adventures." The sound of vehicles approaching signaled the arrival of the first guests. Among them was Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become an integral part of the Foundation's work, teaching traditional gardening methods and sharing stories of Maria's influence on her community. "Mis niñas hermosas," she greeted the girls warmly, embracing them both. "Today is going to be very special. I can feel it." As more guests arrived, the Bennett estate came alive with activity. The main garden had been transformed into an outdoor auditorium, with the children's garden section serving as a natural stage. Garden plots from various schools created a living gallery of achievement, each one telling its own story of growth and community. Isabella and Emma led tours of the different garden sections, proudly explaining the significance of each plant and pathway. Baby Thomas, in his father's old garden-themed baby carrier, accompanied Sarah as she welcomed Foundation families and supporters. Richard found himself drawn to a quiet corner of the garden where a special memorial had been created. Photos of Thomas and Maria smiled out from among the flowers, their young faces full of hope and love. The inscription below read, "From two hearts grew a garden of love that continues to bloom." "It's perfect, isn't it?" Sarah's voice came from behind him. She joined him at the memorial, baby Thomas reaching out to touch the flowers surrounding his parents' photos. "They would have loved this," Richard agreed, watching as Isabella and Emma led another group through the Mexican garden section, explaining the significance of each plant with knowledge and pride. The festival's opening ceremony began with a surprise. Students from each participating school had prepared a special performance. They told the story of Thomas and Maria through dance, music, and poetry, weaving together themes of love, growth, and the connections that bridge all differences. When it was time for Isabella and Emma to speak, they approached the podium together, their matching aprons and flowers symbolizing the unity they had found as sisters. "A year ago," Isabella began, her voice clear and confident, "I thought I had lost everything, but what I didn't know was that love never really goes away. It just grows in new directions." Emma continued, "Our daddy and Isabella's mama taught us that gardens are like families. They need love, patience, and room to grow in their own special way." Together, they introduced their biggest project yet, the Foundation's new Bridge Gardens initiative, which would create community gardens in areas where different neighborhoods met, providing spaces for people to grow together, literally and figuratively. As they spoke, baby Thomas's voice rang out clearly. Garden. His first proper word, spoken at the perfect moment, brought laughter and tears from the audience. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Workshops on sustainable gardening, cooking demonstrations featuring Mrs. Rodriguez's and Maria's recipes, and cultural performances that celebrated the diversity of their growing community. Late in the afternoon, as the festival was winding down, Isabella found a quiet moment in the treehouse. She opened the Bennett Family Chronicles to a new page, ready to document this special day. Emma joined her, followed by Sarah carrying a sleepy Thomas and Richard with a camera full of photos to add to their record. "You know what I realized today," Isabella said thoughtfully, touching her necklaces. "Every single garden we helped create this year has forget-me-nots and marigolds growing together. It's like Mama and Daddy are still helping gardens grow all over the city." "They are," Sarah said softly, adjusting Thomas as he drifted off to sleep. "Through you girls, through the Foundation, through every person who learns their story and understands that love can bridge any distance." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the treehouse windows, the family sat together, adding their memories of the day to their ever-growing chronicle. Below them, the last festival guests wandered through the garden paths, some stopping to admire the memorial, others sitting quietly among the flowers, all touched by the story of a love that continued to grow and spread, season after season. Richard looked at his family, Isabella and Emma heads together as they wrote, Sarah cradling Thomas, Mrs. Hudson arriving with evening refreshments, and felt profound gratitude for all the changes this year had brought. "Your father once told me," he said quietly, "that the best gardens are never finished. They just keep growing in new and surprising ways." "Like love," Isabella smiled, touching her lockets. "It just keeps finding new places to bloom." The evening after the garden festival, the Bennett family gathered in the living room, surrounded by photographs and mementos from the day. Baby Thomas had finally succumbed to sleep after his exciting day, his new word, garden, having been repeated countless times to everyone's delight. Isabella sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging festival photos in the Bennett Family Chronicles, while Emma sorted through the cards and letters they had received from festival participants. Sarah and Richard shared the couch, their faces reflecting both exhaustion and contentment. "Look at this," Emma said, holding up a letter. "It's from that little girl who was afraid to speak during the garden tour. She wrote that our story helped her feel brave enough to tell her own family's story at school." The letter was just one of many they had received, each sharing how the Bennett family's journey had touched and inspired others. Some wrote of finding courage to reconnect with estranged family members, others of starting their own gardens as ways to heal and grow. "Maria would have loved knowing how many people her story has helped," Sarah said softly, looking at a photo of Isabella and Emma, explaining the significance of marigolds to a group of students. Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. Thomas, too. He always believed that one act of kindness could create endless ripples of change. As they continued sorting through the day's memories, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a special delivery, a package that had arrived during the festival. The return address showed it was from Maria's old neighborhood. Isabella opened it carefully, gasping softly at what she found inside. It was a handmade quilt, crafted by the women of her old community. Each patch told part of her mother's story, the flowers she loved, the dreams she had, the love she shared. In the center was a beautifully embroidered forget-me-not, intertwined with a marigold. They remembered, Isabella whispered, running her fingers over the detailed stitching. They remembered everything about her. Emma moved closer, examining the quilt with interest. Look, they included Daddy's garden too, and the tree house, and even baby Thomas. The quilt represented more than just memories. It was a tangible connection between Isabella's past and present, a bridge between her two families, just like her necklaces. We should hang it in the nursery, Sarah suggested, so Thomas can grow up surrounded by all these stories of love and courage. As they discussed where best to display the quilt, a warm breeze carried the scent of night-blooming flowers through the open windows. The garden they had created together was thriving, its influence spreading far beyond their own backyard. Richard suddenly remembered something. I almost forgot. There's one more surprise. He retrieved an envelope from his briefcase. The city council approved our proposal. The old park near Maria's neighborhood will be transformed into the first bridge garden. The news brought excited exclamations from everyone. This particular project had been especially meaningful to Isabella, a way to honor her mother's memory by bringing hope and beauty to the community where she had grown up. Can we help design it? Emma asked eagerly. We could use all the things we learned from our garden. Of course, Richard smiled. In fact, the council specifically requested that our young garden experts be involved in the planning. Isabella stood and walked to the window, looking out at their own garden in the gathering darkness. Solar lights twinkled among the flowers like earthbound stars, illuminating the paths they had created together. You know what's amazing? She said thoughtfully. A year ago, I was so scared and alone. But now, she touched her necklaces, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Now I have 2 families, 2 stories, and twice as much love. Sarah joined her at the window, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Your parents gave us all an incredible gift. They showed us that love doesn't divide when you share it. It multiplies. From upstairs came the sound of baby Thomas stirring, followed by his new favorite word, garden. Everyone laughed, the simple joy of the moment washing over them. As Richard went to check on his nephew, Emma began laying out their plans for the bridge garden on the coffee table. Her design included elements from all their experiences, meditation spaces like the ones they'd created at schools, cultural gardens representing different communities, and of course, plenty of forget-me-nots and marigolds. Mrs. Hudson appeared with evening hot chocolate, still made according to Maria's recipe, and settled in to help with the planning. Over the months, she had become much more than just their housekeeper. She was another bridge between past and present, keeper of family stories both old and new. As the evening deepened into night, the family continued working on their plans, adding ideas and sharing memories. The Bennett family chronicles lay open nearby, its pages filled with a year's worth of love, growth, and transformation. Isabella paused in her planning to write one more entry. Sometimes endings are really just beginnings in disguise. What started with 2 hearts finding love in a garden has grown into something bigger than any of us imagined. Mama and Daddy's love story didn't end. It just changed shape, like flowers turning to face the sun. Now it grows in every garden we plant, blooms in every bridge we build, and lives in every heart we touch with their story. Love, like gardens, needs time to grow, but with patience, care, and faith, it can transform the world, one flower at a time. Outside, fireflies danced among the flowers, their lights like tiny beacons guiding the way forward. The Bennett garden stood as a testament to love's enduring power, to heal, to transform, and to create something beautiful from life's unexpected turns. And in that moment, surrounded by family and wrapped in the warmth of both past and present love, Isabella knew with absolute certainty that some stories never truly end. They just keep growing, season after season, heart after heart, forever blooming in new and wonderful ways. As summer turned to autumn once again, the Bennett estate buzzed with activity. The first bridge garden was nearing completion, and the family was preparing for its grand opening. Baby Thomas, now walking and talking with determination, had made the construction site his favorite destination during their weekend visits. "Flower!" he would exclaim, pointing at each new planting with infectious enthusiasm. His first steps had been taken in their home garden, reaching for a particularly vibrant marigold, and since then he had become the garden's most dedicated tiny explorer. Isabella and Emma had thrown themselves into the Bridge Garden project with characteristic dedication. Their design combined elements from both their parents' histories, Thomas's educational garden concepts and Maria's cultural celebrations, creating a space that truly bridged communities. One crisp morning, as the family supervised the final plantings, Isabella found herself drawn to a particular section of the garden. Here, forget-me-nots and marigolds grew together around a central fountain, its design incorporating elements from both Mexican and American traditions. "It's perfect," Sarah said, joining her with Thomas in tow. "Your parents would have loved this." "They do love it," Isabella corrected gently, touching her necklaces. "I can feel them here, especially when the flowers are blooming." Emma appeared with their latest addition to the Bennett Family Chronicles, its pages now containing not just their family's story, but the stories of all the lives touched by the Foundation's work. "Look what Mrs. Rodriguez brought," she said excitedly, showing them a newly discovered photograph. It showed Thomas and Maria as teenagers, working together in the school garden where their love story began. Richard, reviewing final preparations with the construction team, joined them to see the photo. His expression softened as he studied the young faces of his brother and Maria. "I remember that day," he said quietly. "It was the first time I saw them together." Thomas was teaching Maria about different soil types, and she was teaching him Spanish names for plants. "I thought it was just a tutoring session." He shook his head, smiling at his past self's blindness to love's obvious signs. The photo found a place of honor in the garden's welcome center, alongside the story of how two young people's love had grown into a movement that transformed communities. Visitors would learn about Thomas and Maria's dream of bringing people together through growing things, a dream now being realized in gardens across the city. As the day of the grand opening approached, Isabella spent more time in the treehouse writing in the chronicles. She had begun interviewing people from Maria's old neighborhood, collecting their memories of her mother to preserve for Thomas. "She was like sunshine," Mrs. Rodriguez had told her, sharing stories of Maria's kindness to neighbors in need. "She could make flowers grow in the most unlikely places, just like she could make hope grow in the hardest hearts." The night before the opening, the family gathered in the treehouse for their traditional evening storytelling. Baby Thomas, fighting sleep, insisted on wearing his tiny gardening apron, a miniature version of his sister's with both forget-me-nots and marigolds embroidered on the pocket. "Tell Tommy the beginning," Emma requested, though she and Isabella knew the story by heart, about how love can find its way home no matter what. "Everything ready?" Richard asked, entering with baby Thomas bundled up against the cold. At 15 months, Thomas had become the garden's unofficial mascot, his cheerful greetings and endless enthusiasm for flowers bringing smiles to every visitor's face. Isabella nodded, adjusting the display of photographs that chronicled their family's journey. The images told a story of love that had grown beyond all expectations, from Thomas and Maria's young romance to the thriving community that had bloomed from their legacy. "Mrs. Rodriguez just called," Sarah announced, joining them with a stack of journals. "The storytelling circle is set up in the winter garden room, and the first families are arriving." The winter garden room had been a late addition to their plans, a glass-enclosed space where flowers bloomed year-round, providing a warm haven for community gatherings even in the coldest months. Today, it would host dozens of families sharing their own stories of love, loss, and renewal. "Look who's here," Emma called excitedly, pointing through the window. Making their way carefully along the snow-dusted path was a familiar group, the women who had made Isabella's memory quilt, each carrying something to add to the day's celebrations. As the room filled with visitors, Isabella found herself drawn to the memory bridge, now covered in winter-blooming vines. The panels that held their family's story had inspired others to share their own tales of love transcending boundaries, of hope blooming in unexpected places. Your parents would be so proud, Mrs. Hudson said softly, appearing beside her with hot chocolate for everyone. Not just of the garden, but of how you've helped their love story touch so many lives. The day's events began with Isabella and Emma sharing their family's story once again, but this time they weren't alone. Other children joined in, adding their own chapters to the narrative, how the garden had helped their families heal, how growing things together had built bridges between generations and cultures. Baby Thomas, not content to be a mere spectator, toddled between the groups, offering his signature flower greeting to everyone he met. His innocent joy seemed to break down any remaining barriers between strangers, turning them into friends sharing stories over steaming cups of Maria's special hot chocolate. Sarah watched it all from her favorite spot near the fountain, which flowed year-round with heated water, creating a peaceful backdrop to the day's celebrations. Even in winter, forget-me-nots and marigolds bloomed in the protected spaces around it, their colors bright against the snow beyond the glass walls. "I never imagined this," Richard said, joining her. "When Thomas first told me about his dreams for bringing communities together through gardens, I thought it was impractical. Now look." He gestured to the room full of people sharing stories, building connections, finding hope in each other's experiences. As the afternoon progressed, visitors added their own mementos to the memory bridge: photographs, letters, pressed flowers, each representing a story of love growing in unexpected ways. Isabella and Emma carefully documented everything in the Bennett family chronicles, which had grown into multiple volumes, each filled with tales of hearts finding their way home. "Mama always said that love was like her window box flowers," Isabella shared with a group of children gathered around her. "Sometimes they looked delicate, but their roots were strong enough to weather any storm." She was right. Love is the strongest thing there is. Emma, who had been helping younger children create their own story journals, added, "And Daddy used to say that every garden needs different kinds of flowers to be complete, just like every family has its own special way of growing together." As twilight approached, the winter garden room glowed with warmth and light. Families lingered, reluctant to leave this space where magic seemed possible, and love's legacy was visible in every blooming flower and shared smile. Mrs. Rodriguez gathered everyone for a traditional blessing, just as she had done at the garden's opening. But this time, she invited others to add their own blessings, creating a beautiful tapestry of hopes and dreams spoken in many languages, but all growing from the same soil of love. "You see," she said, her eyes twinkling at Isabella, "your mama and papa planted seeds of love that will never stop growing. Each person who comes here, each story shared, each new connection made, these are all flowers blooming from those first seeds." Later, as the family prepared to close the garden for the evening, Isabella found herself back at the memory bridge. Snow fell softly beyond the glass walls, but inside, surrounded by endless summer blooms, she felt the warm presence of both her parents. Touching her necklaces, the medallion and locket that had become symbols of her journey, she whispered, "Thank you for showing us the way. Your love story didn't end, it just keeps growing in new and beautiful ways." Baby Thomas, fighting sleep in Sarah's arms, pointed to the forget-me-nots and managed a sleepy "Flower" before finally drifting off, secure in the knowledge that he was part of a love story that would continue blooming for generations to come. Spring returned to the bridge garden with an explosion of color and life that seemed to echo the growth and transformation of the past 2 years. On this particular morning, Isabella stood in the garden's center, watching the sunrise just as she had done so many times with Maria, but now surrounded by her expanded family. The occasion was special. They were preparing to bury a time capsule in the garden, filled with memories and messages for future generations. The Bennett family chronicles had inspired this project, prompting families throughout the community to contribute their own stories of love, hope, and renewal. "Is it time?" Emma asked excitedly, holding the beautifully decorated capsule they had created together. It was covered in pressed flowers from their garden, each one carefully preserved to tell part of their story. Sarah nodded, adjusting baby Thomas in his carrier. At 18 months, he was now a constant source of joy and energy, his vocabulary expanding daily, though flower remained his favorite word. He reached out toward the capsule, recognizing the blooms that had become such an integral part of their family's identity. Richard arrived with Mrs. Hudson and Mrs. Rodriguez, each carrying items to add to the capsule. The early morning light caught Isabella's necklaces as she began the ceremony they had planned. 2 years ago, she started, her voice clear in the morning air. A love story that seemed to end actually became a new beginning. Today, we're planting seeds of memory and hope for future generations to discover. One by one, they added their contributions to the capsule. There were letters from both girls to their future selves and others, photographs documenting their journey, seeds from their special flowers, and a copy of the original plans for the bridge garden. Richard included Thomas's last letter, found in the treehouse along with Maria's recipe book. Sarah added baby Thomas's first garden photo, showing him reaching for a forget-me-not. Mrs. Hudson contributed her collection of family recipes, while Mrs. Rodriguez added stories from Maria's childhood. But the most important thing, Emma declared, is this. She carefully placed a newly completed volume of the Bennett family chronicles into the capsule, one specifically written for future readers, telling their story from beginning to that moment. As they prepared to seal the capsule, Isabella spoke again. Our parents taught us that love never really ends. It just changes form, like flowers turning to face the sun. Their love story lives on in every garden we plant, every bridge we build, and every heart we touch with hope. The capsule was carefully lowered into its designated spot, surrounded by forget-me-nots and marigolds that would mark its location. Above it, they placed a small plaque that read, "Here grow the seeds of love's eternal story, planted in hope, tended with memory, blooming forever in hearts yet to come." The Bennett family legacy, founded in love, growing in hope. As they stepped back to admire their work, baby Thomas suddenly pointed to the sky and exclaimed, "Look!" Following his gesture, they saw 2 butterflies, one blue, one golden, dancing together in the morning light, just as they had the day the garden opened. Isabella touched her necklaces, feeling the combined weight of the medallion and locket against her heart. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that their story would continue growing, touching lives and creating connections long after the flowers of that morning had faded. Sarah gathered her children close, while Richard stood protectively behind them. Mrs. Hudson and Mrs. Rodriguez joined them, completing the circle of family that had grown from love's unexpected paths. "You know what?" Emma said thoughtfully. "Every ending really is a new beginning. Our story didn't end when we buried the capsule, it's just starting a new chapter." Isabella nodded, understanding completely. Opening the current volume of their chronicles, she wrote one final entry. "In this garden of love and memory, we plant not just flowers and stories, but hopes and dreams for the future." Our family's tale, begun in love by Thomas and Maria, continues to grow in ways they might never have imagined, but somehow always knew were possible. For love, like the gardens we tend, knows no boundaries of time or space. It blooms in the hearts of those who nurture it, spreads its seeds on the winds of hope and takes root in the most unexpected places. And so our story continues, not with an ending, but with the promise of endless new beginnings, each one as beautiful and unique as the flowers that mark our journey through love's eternal garden. As the sun rose fully over their garden of hope, the family stood together, united by a love that had grown beyond all boundaries and expectations. The morning light caught the dew on countless petals, creating a sparkling reminder that some stories never truly end. They just keep blooming, season after season, heart after heart, forever growing in love's eternal garden. Baby Thomas, secure in the embrace of his family, reached out to touch a forget-me-not, his innocent gesture encompassing all the love and hope their garden represented. "Flower," he declared happily, and in his joy they heard echoes of all the love stories yet to bloom. The garden would continue to grow, touching lives and creating connections they could only imagine. And somewhere, in every flower that bloomed and every heart that found hope in their story, Thomas and Maria's love would live on, eternally blooming in the garden of forever. 5 years had passed since Isabella first stepped into the Bennett family's life, and the spring morning found her once again in the garden, but this time helping her younger brother Thomas plant his very first flower bed. At 6 years old, Thomas had inherited both his father's gentle nature and his mother's determination, especially when it came to growing things. "Like this, Tommy?" he asked, carefully placing a forget-me-not seedling in the soil, just as Isabella had shown him. At 12, she had become quite the expert gardener, her knowledge combining both scientific understanding and the cultural wisdom passed down through Maria's traditions. "Perfect," she smiled, helping him pat the soil around the delicate plant. "Remember what Mama Maria used to say about planting with love? That flowers can feel it in their roots," Thomas recited proudly. Though he had never met either Thomas or Maria, their stories were as familiar to him as nursery rhymes, told and retold through the family chronicles and daily life in the garden. Emma, now 11, approached with her camera. She had developed a passion for photography, documenting the growth and changes in their ever-expanding garden network. The Bridge Garden had inspired similar projects across the city, each one adding its own chapter to their family's legacy of love. "Look who's here," she called out, pointing toward the garden entrance. Sarah and Richard were approaching with Mrs. Rodriguez and Mrs. Hudson, all carrying special packages for today's celebration. It was the 5th anniversary of the Bridge Garden's opening, and families from across the city were gathering to mark the occasion. The garden had grown beyond their wildest dreams, becoming a model for community projects nationwide. "Mama! Uncle Richard!" Thomas ran to greet them, his hands still dirty from planting. "Isabella helped me plant my very own forget-me-nots, and we put marigolds next to them, just like in the story." Sarah hugged her son, not minding the dirt that transferred to her dress. "Your father would be so proud of you, sweetheart. All of you," she added, including the girls in her embrace. Richard, who had gradually transitioned most of his business responsibilities to focus on the foundation's work, carried a special surprise: the original Bennett family chronicles, carefully preserved, but still bearing the marks of countless readings and additions over the years. "I thought we might add a new chapter today," he suggested, settling on one of the garden benches. The years had softened him, turning the once rigid businessman into someone who understood that life's richest moments couldn't be measured in profit margins. Mrs. Hudson began setting up for the celebration, assisted by Mrs. Rodriguez. The two women had become close friends over the years, their shared love for the Bennett children bridging any cultural or social gaps that might once have existed. Isabella touched her necklaces, the medallion and locket she still wore every day, and felt that familiar connection to both her parents. "I think I know what we should write," she said, taking the chronicles from Richard. As families began arriving for the celebration, Isabella sat with her siblings under the flowering arbor that had become their favorite spot. Together, they began to write, "5 years ago, we planted seeds of hope in this garden. We didn't know then how far their flowers would reach or how many hearts they would touch, but our parents, all of them, knew. They understood that love, like a garden, needs only fertile soil and open hearts to grow beyond all boundaries." The day unfolded like a flower opening to the sun, filled with stories of lives transformed by the garden's influence. Children who had grown up attending the Foundation's programs now led tours for newcomers. Families who had once been strangers shared meals and traditions, their differences bridged by the common ground they had found in the garden. Thomas, ever the enthusiastic gardener, proudly showed visitors his new flower bed, explaining with childhood wisdom how the forget-me-nots and marigolds were best friends just like our families. As evening approached, the garden lights began to twinkle on, solar-powered stars that made the paths magical in the growing dusk. Isabella found a quiet moment to add one more note to the chronicles. "The greatest gift our parents gave us wasn't the garden itself, but the understanding that love grows best when it's shared. Every flower we plant, every story we tell, every connection we make is part of their continuing love story. And like the perennial flowers that return each spring, their love blooms anew in every heart touched by this garden." The celebration continued into the evening, with families sharing food, stories, and dreams for the future. Under the arbor, 3 siblings sat together, Isabella holding the chronicles, Emma with her camera, and Thomas with his dirty gardening apron, each carrying forward a different aspect of their family's legacy. Above them, 2 butterflies danced in the evening light, their wings catching the last rays of sun in shades of blue and gold. and in the gentle breeze that carried the mingled scents of forget-me-nots and marigolds, one could almost hear the whispered promise that love, like the gardens they tended, would continue to grow and bloom for generations to come. The 10th anniversary of Isabella's arrival at the Bennet household dawned bright and clear, the garden resplendent in full summer bloom. At 15, Isabella had grown into a poised young woman, her mother's grace and father's kindness evident in every gesture. The medallion and locket still hung around her neck, no longer just symbols of her past, but beacons lighting the way forward. Emma, now 14, moved through the garden with her ever-present camera, capturing the preparations for today's special celebration. 9-year-old Thomas followed her, proudly pointing out the sections of the garden he had helped develop, his knowledge of plants and their stories growing as steadily as the flowers themselves. "Remember when we first planted these?" Isabella asked Emma, kneeling beside their original flower bed. The forget-me-nots and marigolds had spread beyond their initial boundaries, creating a natural tapestry that seemed to tell their family's story in blooms and leaves. "It feels like yesterday and forever ago at the same time," Emma replied, snapping a photo of the morning dew on the petals, "just like when you first came home to us." Sarah watched her children from the kitchen window, her heart full of the kind of joy that comes from seeing love grow and multiply beyond all expectations. The Bennet mansion, once a symbol of wealth and status, had become a true home, warm, welcoming, and filled with the kind of riches that couldn't be measured in money. Richard joined her, his hair now distinguished with grey, but his eyes bright with the wisdom that comes from learning life's most important lessons. "The foundation board just approved our 100th Bridge Garden project," he announced quietly. "Thomas and Maria's legacy has spread across the country." The Bridge Gardens had indeed grown beyond their wildest dreams, each one unique to its community, but all sharing the core elements that had made the first garden so special: forget-me-nots and marigolds growing side by side, spaces for families to connect, and stories of love bridging all differences. Mrs. Hudson and Mrs. Rodriguez arrived early, carrying baskets of food prepared from their combined treasury of family recipes. Over the years, they had become the garden's unofficial historians, keeping alive the stories of how it all began and helping new families find their place in the growing community. As guests began arriving for the anniversary celebration, Isabella gathered her siblings near the memory bridge, now covered in flowering vines and decades of stories. The Bennet family chronicles, multiple volumes strong, lay open beside them. 10 years ago, she began, her voice carrying the strength of someone who knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. "I thought I had lost everything. But what I really found was that love never ends. It just grows in new and amazing ways." Thomas, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Can we add my story too?" he asked, pulling out a carefully folded paper from his pocket. "About how, even though I never met our dad and Mama Maria, I know them through every flower we grow and every story we tell." Emma wrapped an arm around her little brother's shoulders. "That's perfect, Tommy, because that's what this garden is all about, keeping love alive and growing through every new generation." Sarah and Richard joined their children, and together they added Thomas's words to the chronicles. His childish handwriting told a story of love that transcended time and space, of family bonds that grew stronger with each passing season, and of hope that bloomed eternal in the garden of memory. As the day progressed, the garden filled with familiar faces and new friends, all drawn together by the legacy of love that had started with two young people falling in love in a school garden so many years ago. Children played along the paths while their parents shared stories and dreams, the boundaries between different communities, dissolving like morning mist in the summer sun. In a quiet moment, Isabella found herself back at the original flower bed, where her journey with the Bennets had truly begun. Emma's camera captured the moment as she knelt to touch the flowers, her necklaces catching the light just as they had that first day. "You know what I've learned?" she said to her siblings as they joined her. "Love is like these flowers. It might seem delicate, but its roots go deep and strong. And when you tend it with care and share it freely, it just keeps growing and spreading, creating beauty wherever it goes." Thomas nodded solemnly, his gardener's hands gentle as he touched a forget-me-not. "Like Daddy and Mama Maria's love story," he said. It didn't end. It just changed into something bigger, something that keeps growing through us and everyone whose life is touched by these gardens. As evening approached, the family gathered one last time around the memory bridge to add their final notes to this chapter of the Chronicles. But as Isabella began to write, she realized that there could never really be a final chapter to their story. Because love, like gardens, doesn't know endings, she wrote. It only knows new beginnings, new growth, new ways of reaching toward the light. Our parents gave us the greatest gift of all, the understanding that love multiplies when you share it, grows stronger when you tend it, and blooms eternal in the hearts of those who believe in its power. Above them, as if in blessing, 2 butterflies danced in the evening light, one blue, one gold, their wings catching the last rays of sun, just as they had on so many important days before. And in the gentle breeze that carried the mingled scents of forget-me-nots and marigolds, the garden seemed to whisper its eternal promise: love, like flowers, will always find a way to bloom,